The nurse's scrubs were still damp with someone else's blood when Officer Dale Rourke laughed in her face. He laughed the way men laugh when they've decided they already know everything worth knowing, loud, short, dismissive. Then he reached into her bag without permission, yanked out a laminated credential she'd never shown a civilian in 3 years, and said, "What is this supposed to be?" Nora Vásquez had spent 4 years pulling soldiers out of burning vehicles in places most people couldn't find on a map. She had sutured wounds in the dark, carried men twice her size on her back, and made decisions in seconds that doctors debated for hours. She said nothing. She let him keep talking. That was her first mistake, and it was intentional. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read every single one. Let's see how far this story travels. The shift had started at 6 the previous evening and hadn't released her until nearly 5:30 in the morning. Nora Vásquez drove with the windows cracked despite the cold, the January air biting at her left arm where it rested on the door. It was the only thing keeping her alert. The heater in her 09 Civic worked, but barely, and the smell of warm recycled air made her eyes heavy in a way that 16-hour shifts no longer did. She was used to exhaustion. What she wasn't used to was the silence after, the particular quiet of early morning streets when the world hadn't yet remembered how loud it liked to be. Castleford Memorial was 22 minutes from her apartment on a good morning. She'd timed it enough to know the variables. The freight train crossing on Aldrich that sometimes added 7 minutes, the school zone on Pembroke that didn't matter before 7, the right turn onto Sutter that most people missed and she never did. She knew this drive the way she'd once known patrol routes. Not memorized so much as absorbed, the knowledge sitting somewhere below conscious thought. She was 4 blocks into Harlow Heights when the lights hit her mirror. Blue and white, strobing in that particular rhythm that never stopped meaning the same thing no matter how many years passed. Nora glanced at her speedometer, 31 in a 30, and felt a low familiar tension settle into her shoulders. Not fear. Not quite. The feeling was closer to the one she got when a patient's chart didn't add up, when something was wrong and she didn't yet know what. She pulled to the curb cleanly, cut the engine, and put both hands on the steering wheel before the officer had finished parking. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour. Harlow Heights sat on the western edge of Castleford, a town within a town that called itself a borough, but functioned more like a gated community that had forgotten to install the gate. The houses were large, the sidewalks were clean, and the streets were the kind that got plowed first after a snowstorm. Nora had driven through it 100 times. She lived 2 miles east of the borough line, in a part of Castleford where the plows came second and the streetlights flickered. The officer took his time. She watched him in the side mirror, the deliberate slowness of a man who'd decided the approach was part of the message. Mid-30s, square-shouldered, the kind of build that suggested the gym mattered to him personally. His name tag read Rourke in block letters. He stopped at her rear quarter panel and stood there for a moment, looking at her car like he was cataloging it. "License and registration," he said when he finally reached her window. Not a question. "Of course." She kept her voice flat and reached for the glove box at the measured pace she'd learned to use around armed people. License first, then registration from beneath the insurance card, both handed over without comment. Rourke looked at them, looked at her, looked back at the license. "You got any idea why I stopped you?" "I'm not sure," Nora said. "I was doing 31. 33, he said. She didn't argue. 3 miles over wasn't worth the energy it would take to dispute, and she knew from long experience that arguing a number with a man who'd already made up his mind about you accomplished nothing except making him feel like he'd won something. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle." Nora's hand stayed on the wheel. "Can I ask the reason?" "I smell something." She waited a beat. "I'm a trauma nurse. I've been at Castleford Memorial for the last 16 hours. If you're smelling disinfectant or latex, that's a reasonable explanation." Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "Trauma nurse," he repeated, drawing it out slightly, giving it just enough space to sound like a question. "Yes." "Right." He stepped back. "Out of the vehicle, please." There was a second officer in the patrol car. Nora could see him now, younger, sitting in the passenger seat with the door cracked. He hadn't gotten out yet. He was watching, which was either professionalism or discomfort. She didn't yet know which. She got out slowly, ID lanyard still around her neck, Castleford Memorial badge visible against her navy scrubs. She stood on the curb in the pre-dawn cold with her arms slightly out from her body, offering no resistance, giving no angle, the way she'd been trained to handle situations where the variables hadn't resolved yet. Rourke circled to the passenger side and tried the handle. Trunk release? Inside the car, left of the steering column. He came back around, leaned in without asking, and popped it. She heard him moving things in the trunk. Her spare kit was back there, the one she'd kept since her second deployment. A waterproof case with gloves, a tourniquet, trauma shears, hemostatic gauze. Standard equipment for anyone who'd spent enough time in places where the next ambulance was 30 minutes out. The second officer had gotten out of the car. He was young, late 20s maybe, with a cautious quality about him, like someone who was still deciding who he wanted to be in this job. His name tag read Gentry. "Rourke," he said quietly, "you need me to run the plates?" "Already ran them," Rourke said, not looking up from the trunk. "Registered to her." "So what are we looking for?" Rourke didn't answer. He pulled out the waterproof case, turned it over in his hands. "What's in here?" "Emergency medical supplies," Nora said. "Trauma kit. I keep it in the car." "Why?" "Because I'm a trauma nurse and I've found people bleeding on the side of roads." He set it on the bumper and unsnapped the latches. She watched him go through it with the systematic disregard of someone who'd decided what they were looking for before they started looking. He turned over each item, held up the tourniquet like it was suspicious. "This military issue?" "Yes." He looked at her. "You in the military?" "I was." Something shifted in his face. Not softening, the opposite. "What branch?" "Navy." He put the tourniquet down and kept moving through the case. The gauze. The gloves. A folded emergency contact card in a zippered pocket, and beneath the card, something he wasn't supposed to see. A secondary credential laminated in blue, attached to a small metal case no bigger than a cigarette box. He held it up. Nora felt the shift in her chest the way she felt a monitor change rhythm, immediate, registering before conscious thought. "What's this?" "It's a federal medical credential," she said. "I'd ask you to put it back." Rourke turned it over. The insignia on the front was a combination she'd never had to explain to a civilian before because civilians weren't supposed to encounter it. Medical Corps emblem. Navy SEAL overlay. A designation code that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. "Federal," he said, letting the word sit there like a joke he was deciding whether to tell. "You're a federal something?" "I'm a trauma nurse at Castleford Memorial. The credential is separate. I'd ask you not to handle the case." He laughed. Short, dismissive, the laugh she'd heard in the first few seconds of this story. He held the case up to show Gentry, who looked at it and said nothing, his face carefully blank. "You think this is real?" Rourke said. "It is real." "Right." He set it on the bumper beside the tourniquet. "You got a federal credential and you're driving home from a nursing shift at 5 in the morning in a 2009 Civic." Nora looked at him steadily. "People with federal credentials drive older cars." "Sure they do." He stepped back, folded his arms. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the station." Gentry moved slightly. "Dale, there's an unregistered substance in that case," Rourke said, gesturing toward the hemostatic gauze. Nora felt something go very cold inside her. Not anger, not fear. The feeling was surgical, the precision of someone identifying exactly when a situation had stopped being manageable. "That's hemostatic gauze," she said. "It's a standard medical product available in any surgical supply catalog. It's not a controlled substance. It's not labeled. It's from a trauma kit. It doesn't need to be labeled by the person carrying it." "I'm going to need you to come to the station," Rourke said again. And this time it wasn't a request. Gentry was looking at the credential case. Something in his expression had changed. "Rourke, that insignia, it's a prop." Rourke picked the case back up and dropped it into an evidence bag he'd produced from his belt. "Lady goes to some military surplus store, buys herself a fancy badge. Not the first time." Nora watched the case go into the bag. The blue laminated credential. The metal case. The embedded transmitter inside that she had not yet activated, and for one moment, for one clear second, she made a decision about when she would. Not yet. The Harlow Heights Police Department occupied a brick building on Crestwood Lane that had been renovated sometime in the early 2000s, updated with glass panels and a new reception desk. But the bones of it were still 1970s municipal, low ceilings, fluorescent lights, the smell of old coffee, and synthetic carpet. Rourke walked her in through the side entrance, past a desk officer who glanced up and then back at his screen without apparent interest. The holding area was down a short hallway, not a cell, exactly, but a room with a reinforced door and a bolted bench and no windows. Nora sat down. She was still wearing her hospital badge. She hadn't taken it off because no one had asked her to, and she wanted it visible, wanted the deliberate absurdity of the situation to be legible to anyone who walked through that door. They'd taken the evidence bag. They hadn't taken her lanyard. Rourke had processed her himself, which told her something about how seriously he wanted this to look official. He'd written up a report she hadn't been allowed to read, and when she'd asked for a copy, he'd said it was in process. She'd asked for a phone call. He'd said she wasn't under arrest. She was being detained for questioning, which was the kind of legal gray space that required knowing exactly how much you wanted to push. She knew exactly. She'd asked for his supervisor's name. He'd said Captain Aldridge was off duty. She'd asked what time he came on duty. Rourke had closed the door. Alone in the room, Nora sat with her hands loose in her lap and let herself breathe through it. The fluorescent light, the bolted bench, the coffee smell from somewhere down the hall. She assessed the situation the way she assessed every situation. What she knew, what she didn't know, what she controlled, what she didn't. She knew Rourke had taken the case. She knew the case contained a transmitter. She knew that activating it would trigger a response she couldn't take back. A response that would escalate the situation in a direction that had consequences she couldn't fully predict. She knew that Rourke didn't understand what he'd picked up. She reached into the left pocket of her scrubs, past the pen she always kept there, and the nitrile gloves she hadn't needed tonight, and found the secondary transmitter, the backup, the one she kept on her person precisely for situations where the primary was unavailable. It was smaller than a pen cap, matte black, unremarkable. 2 seconds of contact pressure, sustained. She thought about Gentry's face when he'd looked at the credential. That slight change. The way he'd said Rourke's first name, quiet, like a warning. She thought about the man she'd treated last night, the one who'd come in at 2 a.m. with a laceration from a broken glass that had nicked something it shouldn't have. She'd kept him from bleeding out by 3:15. He'd squeezed her hand before they took him to surgery. She pressed the transmitter, held it for 2 seconds, let go. Then she folded her hands back in her lap and waited. Rourke was at the coffee machine in the break room when his partner found him. Gentry came in without announcing himself, which was unusual enough that Rourke turned. The younger officer's face had the look of someone who'd been sitting with something uncomfortable and had finally decided to say it out loud. "I looked up the credential insignia," Gentry said. Rourke poured his coffee. "Fake." "I'm not sure it is." "It's a laminated badge she bought online. People do it for the—" "No, I looked it up in the Federal Registry database. The Medical Corps emblem with that specific overlay." Gentry pulled out his phone. "That designation code is assigned to units attached to the Naval Special Operations Medical Support Group. It's not a public-facing designation. You can't just— It's not something you can buy. The overlay is specific to field operators who've been seconded to federal emergency response frameworks." Rourke sipped his coffee. "Dale, if that credential is real, we just detained a federal medical officer. She's a nurse at a local hospital who said she used to be in the Navy. She said she's currently credentialed, not that she used to be. There's a difference." Gentry was quiet for a moment. "I think we should call Captain Aldridge. Aldridge is off duty." "I know that." Rourke set his cup down. The overhead light in the break room was slightly different from the rest of the building, warmer, and in that light his expression was harder to read. He wasn't stupid. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that he'd made a decision in the first 30 seconds of the traffic stop, and the entire subsequent situation had become, in his mind, a matter of proving that decision right. "She's in there for questioning," he said. "We ask our questions and she goes home." "What questions? You haven't questioned her." Rourke picked up his coffee again. Gentry looked at him for another moment, then left. In the corridor outside the break room, he stopped. He pulled out his phone again, pulled up the Federal Registry database, and stared at the entry he'd found. The one that listed the designation code, that listed the unit designation, and that listed in small print at the bottom, A protocol number he'd never seen before and a contact line flagged with a security clearance he didn't have. He didn't call Captain Aldridge. He went back to the holding room hallway instead, stopped outside the door, and thought about the woman on the other side of it, quiet, still, hospital badge clipped to her chest, hands folded. He'd been in this job for 3 years. He'd been Rourke's partner for 8 months, and in 8 months he'd developed a specific and uncomfortable feeling about certain situations. The feeling of watching something go wrong in slow motion, knowing the math, not yet knowing how to stop it. He went to his desk and pulled up the Federal Emergency Contacts database. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the transmitter had already done its work. 430 miles away, in a building that didn't appear on public maps, a system flagged. Commander Elias Wren was finishing a briefing on a separate operation when the notification came through. He was 61 years old, former Special Operations Medical Division, currently assigned to the Federal Emergency Medical Response Coordination Office, a designation that meant very little to anyone outside a specific set of agencies and a great deal to everyone inside it. He'd been in roles like this long enough that the notification sound had been changed twice, because humans adapt to sounds they hear too often, and the system required reaction time to remain consistent. He looked at the screen. He saw the credential ID. He saw the location. He looked at his deputy, Commander Grace Aldine, who had also looked up. "Who is she?" she asked. "Lieutenant Nora Vásquez," Wren said. "Former Navy Special Operations combat medic. 8 years field deployment across 3 theaters. Currently embedded in civilian capacity at Castleford Memorial, maintaining Federal Reserve classification." He paused. "She was attached to the SOMU during the Meridian operation." Aldine was quiet for a moment. She knew what the Meridian operation was. "Whoever put her in that room," Wren said, "did it without verifying her credential, which means they either didn't know what it was or they knew and didn't care." He looked at the location data. Harlow Heights, a local police department. Either way, they just made this a federal incident. He picked up the phone. Well, Nora heard the station before she saw what was happening to it. She'd been sitting in the holding room for 40 minutes when she felt it. A low vibration in the floor, the kind that preceded large vehicles. More than one. Moving in coordinated approach. Then the windows. The building's windows were frosted on the first floor, but she could see the change in light through the one high above the door. The strobing blue and red of multiple vehicles, different patterns. The kind of layered lighting that meant multiple agencies, not a single cruiser. Then voices in the hallway, multiple voices, the sharp edge of authority on all of them, and underneath that, what she recognized as the specific confusion of people who'd been comfortable and had suddenly stopped being comfortable. The door opened. Not Rourke, not Gentry. A man she'd never met, in a jacket with federal markings, holding a credential case that looked nothing like a prop. Behind him, 2 more in tactical vests. "Lieutenant Vásquez." "Yes." "I'm Deputy Director Harmon, FEMRQO. We have your location confirmed." He looked at her wrists. She'd been cuffed for the second half of her detention after she'd asked for a supervisor a second time, and Rourke had decided she was being difficult. Harmon looked at the cuffs. His jaw shifted slightly. "Where are your keys?" "Officer Rourke has them." Harmon turned to the officer behind him. Gentry, she realized, who had apparently made a decision at some point in the last 40 minutes, and said something she couldn't hear. Gentry left at a near run. Harmon sat down on the bench beside her, not across from her, which was a choice. He was in his 50s, precise, the kind of quiet that came from long practice. He looked at her hospital badge. "You're working tonight?" "I just finished a shift," Nora said. 16 hours. He nodded slowly. "The credential was in the evidence bag they logged?" "Yes, the case was in my trunk kit. He found it." "Okay." Harmon straightened. Through the open door she could hear the station, not chaotic, which was the worst kind of chaos, but systematically restructuring itself around an authority that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She heard Commander Wren's voice somewhere down the hallway, deeper than she'd expected from phone communications, deliberate, and she heard someone, probably Rourke, saying something that got cut off. Gentry returned with the keys. Harmon uncuffed her himself. She looked at her wrists. The skin was bruised where the cuffs had been applied tighter than necessary. Not dangerously, but definitely not standard. "The evidence bag," she said. "We've secured it." Harmon looked at her for a moment. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that what happens next is going to move quickly and it's going to be public. You have the right to step back from that process entirely if you choose. Nora thought about Rourke's laugh, the way he'd held up the credential like it was a curiosity, like it was something she'd bought at a surplus store. She thought about the 40 minutes on the bench, the cuffs applied tighter than they needed to be, the report she hadn't been allowed to see. She thought about Gentry's face in the break room hallway, the decision he'd made at his desk. "I'm not stepping back," she said. "What?" In the main area of the Harlow Heights Police Department, things had stopped moving the way they normally moved. 3 federal vehicles were parked outside, and that number had just become 5. 2 helicopters had passed overhead, their lights visible through the station windows, and the officers who'd been on overnight shift had drifted to the front of the building with the particular stillness of people who understood that the situation had changed but hadn't yet been told how. Commander Wren stood in the center of the room. He was the kind of person who didn't raise his voice in direct proportion to how much he needed to be heard. Instead, his voice got quieter, more precise, which was somehow worse. The 2 senior officers he'd been speaking with when the transmitter activated, Captain Frank Aldridge, who had come in from off-duty with a pallor that suggested he'd understood immediately what kind of call he was getting, and a sergeant whose name Wren had been given and hadn't used yet, were standing 2 feet in front of him. Rourke was to the side. Rourke, Wren had noted, was a man who hadn't yet fully understood what was happening. He had the expression of someone who'd encountered an obstacle and was still calculating how to go around it. "The credential she was carrying," Wren said, "is issued by the Federal Emergency Medical Response Coordination Office under the authority of the Department of Defense Medical Reserve Classification Act. Its holder is authorized to operate in any medical emergency capacity within federal jurisdiction, and any interference with that holder's ability to function is a federal matter." He paused. "The credential has a verification protocol. It's printed on the back. There is a phone number. Calling that number takes 40 seconds. Rourke's jaw moved. "Nobody called," Wren said. It wasn't a question. Aldridge looked at the floor. "I want to see the report that was filed," Wren said, turning to the desk officer who'd been hovering near the filing cabinet. "All reports filed tonight. Body camera footage from both officers on this stop. Dispatch logs from this shift." He looked at Aldridge. "And I want your evidence room log from the past 18 months. The room got very quiet. Aldridge's pallor had deepened. He was a man in his late 50s who'd run this department for 11 years, and something in the way he stood, the particular set of his shoulders, told Wren that the evidence room request hadn't surprised him as much as it should have. That was interesting. Gentry was standing near the back wall, separate from the other officers. He'd made the call from his desk, not to Aldridge, not to the federal number he'd found in the database, but to the emergency contact at the bottom of the credential listing, the one flagged with a security clearance level. He'd done it because he'd sat at his desk and looked at the phone number for a full 3 minutes and decided that being complicit in not calling was a worse outcome than whatever calling would bring. He still wasn't sure he'd done the right thing. He suspected that uncertainty was probably a sign that he had. They brought Nora out of the holding room at 6:47 in the morning. The station was different than it had been when they'd brought her in. The energy of it, the comfortable mid-shift routine she'd felt walking through it cuffed, was gone, replaced by something tighter, more careful. Officers she didn't recognize had positioned themselves at the evidence room door and the filing area. Harmon walked beside her. Wren was waiting near the front desk. He was taller than she'd expected. He looked at her and gave a small nod that carried the weight of something unsaid. "Lieutenant?" "Commander Wren," she said. "Thank you for the quick response." 43 minutes from activation to arrival, he said. "That's outside our target window. We're going to review the dispatch sequencing." She nearly smiled. Only someone who'd been in that world would respond to their own response time with a self-evaluation. Rourke was standing near the side hallway. He'd been moved there by one of the federal officers, positioned in the particular way that isn't arrest, but functions as containment. He was watching her cross the room, and his expression had changed. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something complicated that she recognized as a man reassessing information he'd decided he didn't need. She didn't look at him directly. Wren walked her to the main desk, where her evidence bag had been opened and its contents laid out on a clean sheet of paper. The credential case, the trauma kit items, her license and registration. She picked up the credential case, opened it. The transmitter indicator was dark. Signal sent, signal confirmed. She closed it and put it in her pocket. The report Officer Rourke filed, Harmon said, appearing at her shoulder and speaking quietly, contains a description of the hemostatic gauze as an unidentified substance of unknown origin. The trunk kit is logged as evidence of possible medical supply theft. Nora absorbed that. There's more, Harmon said. We ran the evidence log from the room. 18-month period. He paused. 14 similar stops. 12 of those resulted in evidence being logged that was subsequently listed as a match with reports from area pharmacies about missing medication. 6 of those cases went to the DA's office. The hospital badge was still around her neck. She looked at it. 6 cases. 6 people. She put her hand on the edge of the desk and steadied herself. Not because she was going to fall, but because the weight of what Harmon was describing required a moment of acknowledgement before she could function past it. 16 hours of surgery and blood and monitoring, and then the drive and the lights and the mirror and the laugh and the cuffs. And underneath all of it, underneath her own story, there were 6 other stories she hadn't known about. Are those cases still active? She asked. One of them is in trial right now, Harmon said, as of this morning. Nora looked across the room. Rourke hadn't moved. He was watching her the way people watch things they'd miscalculated, with the dawning and specific horror of someone who'd treated a situation as manageable and was only now understanding the scale of what they'd been cavalier about. I'll need to give a statement, Nora said. Yes, Harmon said. You'll have time. Through the front windows of the Harlow Heights Police Department, the street was bright with federal vehicle lights and the pale blue of an early January morning. 2 more vehicles had arrived in the last 5 minutes. Someone, she could hear the voice but not see the person, was asking about evidence room chain of custody, and someone else was saying something about the DA's office and a hold. Rourke took a step toward the hallway. One of Harmon's officers moved to intercept him before he'd taken 2. Sir, the officer said, I'm going to need you to stay right there. Rourke stopped. He looked at the officer. He looked at the room, the federal presence filling it, the body camera footage being pulled, the evidence log being photographed item by item. He looked at Nora, who was standing at the desk with her hospital badge around her neck and her federal credential in her pocket, and 16 hours of someone else's work still dried under her fingernails. She's nobody, Rourke said, and it was clear the moment he said it that it was a reflex, the last-ditch assertion of the version of events he'd built in the first 30 seconds of the traffic stop, the one that was collapsing around him in real time. She works at a hospital. She's not Officer Rourke, Wren's voice from across the room. Quiet. Precise. Rourke stopped talking. The credential is real, Wren said. The designation is active. The case you placed in an evidence bag has a federal equipment registration number that tracks to an active Federal Medical Reserve classification. He paused. And the evidence room log you just heard mentioned is now the subject of a federal hold. The station was very quiet. Someone's going to want to talk to you about those 14 stops, Wren said. Rourke looked at the floor. Outside the windows, the morning had fully arrived, cold, bright, and different to the specific human wreckage accumulating inside the building it illuminated. Nora picked up her license and registration and slid them into her pocket next to the credential case. She looked at Gentry, who was still standing near the back wall. He met her eyes for a moment. She gave him a nod. Not warm exactly, but acknowledging. He'd made a decision. She knew what that cost. She turned toward Harmon. I need to get home, she said. I have a shift tonight. Harmon looked at her for a moment. We'll need your formal statement first. I know. She glanced back at the room, Rourke still at the side hallway, the federal officers at the evidence room door, Wren talking quietly into a phone in the corner, and somewhere behind all of it, the weight of 6 cases she hadn't known existed an hour ago. I'll stay as long as you need. Then from the evidence room, a voice, sharp, cutting through the controlled quiet of the building like a scalpel. Commander Wren, you're going to want to see what's in here. The room shifted. Officers moved. Harmon straightened. Wren lowered his phone and walked toward the evidence room door with the particular unhurried pace of someone who'd expected something and was now going to see exactly what shape it had taken. Nora didn't follow. She stood at the desk and looked at her hands, steady, the way they always were, the way she'd trained them to be. The way they'd remained through 4 years of field medicine and 3 of trauma nursing and 43 minutes on a bolted bench in a holding room. From the evidence room, the voice again. Lower this time, controlled, but carrying the weight of something that would not be easily put down. There's a notebook. The notebook was brown. Soft cover, the kind sold in bulk at office supply stores, with a rubber band around it that had been there long enough to leave an impression in the cover. Commander Wren stood in the evidence room doorway and looked at it without touching it, and the federal officer who'd found it, a woman named Rios who handled document forensics, was holding it open to a page near the middle with gloved hands. "It's a log," Rios said. "Dates, names, vehicle descriptions, stop locations. Notations in the margin." She turned it slightly so Wren could see without touching. Some of the notation codes repeat. We'll need a full forensic pass to decode the system, but the dates match the stops in the evidence log. Wren looked at the notation codes. Columns, consistent, the habit of someone who'd been doing this long enough to develop a system. Not a diary. A record. "Who else has been in this room?" he asked. "On the log?" Rios said. "Rourke, Captain Aldridge, 2 other officers, Sergeant Pruitt and Officer Gaines. Aldridge's name appears on the authorization line for 11 of the 14 evidence entries." Wren looked at the doorway, back toward the main room where Aldridge was standing, and then back at the notebook. "Bag it," he said. "Full chain of custody from this point. Nobody else handles it without my sign-off." He walked back into the main room. Aldridge had moved. He was near the side hallway now, which was the direction of the back exit, and one of Harmon's officers had noticed and repositioned accordingly. Aldridge stopped when he saw the repositioning. He had the look of a man who'd been running a calculation in his head and had just arrived at a number he didn't like. Wren stopped in front of him. "Captain Aldridge," he said, "when did you come on duty tonight?" "I was called in," Aldridge said. "I was off duty." "I know, before that. Your last shift." Aldridge looked at him. "Yesterday afternoon, 3 to 11. Were you aware of any active federal credentials among individuals stopped by your officers in the last 18 months? No? Not something you would have been notified about? No, Aldridge stopped. He was working something out. Wren could see it. The phrasing, the angle of the question, where the right answer actually was. "We process a lot of stops." "I'm sure you do." Wren looked at him steadily. "Your authorization appears on 11 evidence log entries in the last 18 months. Evidence from stops your officers conducted. Some of that evidence was subsequently forwarded to the DA's office as part of criminal cases." Aldridge said nothing. "I'm going to need you to stay in this building," Wren said. "Don't use your phone." He walked away before Aldridge could respond, which was intentional. Nora watched the exchange from the desk. She couldn't hear the specifics, but she could read the architecture of it. Wren's stillness, Aldridge's sequence of expressions, the way the conversation ended with Aldridge standing alone near the wall while Wren moved on. She'd seen that structure before, in other rooms, other contexts. It was the structure of a situation that had stopped being about one person. Harmon appeared at her side. "Your formal statement, I'd like to start that now, if you're ready. We have a room in the back." "The one I was just in?" He paused. "Different room." She followed him. The room was smaller than the holding area, a proper interview room with a table and 2 chairs and a camera mount that currently held nothing. Harmon sat across from her with a recorder and a legal pad, and they went through it in order. The traffic stop, the timeline, Rourke's exact words, the search of the vehicle, the specific items he'd handled, the credential case, the evidence bag, the station intake process, the cuffs. She answered everything cleanly and accurately because she had a good memory and she'd already committed the sequence to a kind of internal record during the 43 minutes on the bench. Harmon wrote and listened. He didn't push. He was the kind of interviewer who understood that silence was a tool and used it deliberately, and she respected that without needing to be managed by it. "The cuffs," he said at one point. "You said tighter than necessary." "Yes." "Can you be more specific about what you mean by that?" "Standard restraint cuffing allows enough wrist mobility that circulation isn't significantly impaired. These didn't. My hands were partially numb within about 15 minutes. She looked at her wrists. The bruising had darkened slightly. Not severe, but visible. A clear band around each wrist. "It's not unusual in itself. It may have been careless rather than deliberate. I'm not making a judgment about intent." Harmon looked at the bruising. He made a note. When you activated the transmitter, he said, you'd been in the holding room for how long? Approximately 12 minutes. What made you wait that long? She considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, not the clean professional one. I wanted to see if anyone in the building was going to correct it on their own, she said. I wanted to know what kind of place I was dealing with. Harmon looked at her. And? Gentry looked up the credential. That tells me something. Whether he'd have done anything about it without outside pressure, I don't know. She paused. Aldridge came in from off-duty. That tells me something else. What does it tell you? That someone called him, before the federal contact was made. Someone in this building made a call to the captain before I activated the transmitter, which means they understood something was wrong, and their first instinct was to manage it internally, not to correct it. Harmon was quiet for a moment. He wrote something down. You were a Special Operations Combat Medic for how long? 8 years active, the last 3 in field deployment. And you've held the Federal Reserve classification since? Since separation. I was approached 6 months before my discharge date. It's primarily a standby designation. They maintain a small network of credentialed medical operators in civilian roles in case of mass casualty events requiring field-level triage outside normal emergency response capacity. You've been called up twice in the last 4 years, Harmon said, and she understood he'd read her file before coming in. Yes. Both times you responded and completed the assignment. Yes. And in between, you worked trauma nursing at Castleford Memorial. Yes. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone reassessing an assumption they'd made and finding it inadequate. I want to be direct with you, he said. What's in that evidence room is potentially significant beyond your stop tonight. If it goes where the preliminary review suggests it might go, you're going to be called as a witness in proceedings that are larger and more complicated than a single unlawful detention. That will put you in public view in ways that may be uncomfortable given the nature of your federal classification. I understand that. The classification itself will likely become a matter of public record in any legal proceeding. I understand that too. Harmon nodded slowly. Okay. He clicked off the recorder. That's enough for tonight. I'll need you back tomorrow for a follow-up, but you should go home. She stood up. Her body registered the movement. 16-hour shift plus nearly an hour of detention, plus the specific tension of sitting still while angry, which was its own kind of exhaustion. The case in trial, she said at the door. Which one? You said one of the 6 cases from Rourke's stops is currently in trial, as of this morning. Harmon looked at her. Yes. What's the charge? He paused for just a moment too long. Possession with intent. The defendant is facing 8 years. She looked at him steadily. The evidence that put him there is currently under a federal hold, Harmon said. We've already contacted the trial court. She held his gaze. 8 years. A person sitting in a courtroom right now, today, with a jury deliberating or a judge considering or a verdict pending, and the foundation of the case against them was evidence that Rourke had pulled from a car the same way he'd pulled her trauma kit, the same casual certainty, the same dismissiveness. Okay, she said. I'll be back tomorrow. She walked out through the main room, past the desk and the repositioned officers and Wren's quiet, ongoing authority, past Aldridge standing near the wall, past the evidence room door where Rios was still working. She walked out through the side entrance into the January morning. Her car was still at the curb on the street where she'd pulled over. 2 blocks north, on Crestwood Lane, the federal vehicles were visible from here. She started her car, put the heat on, and sat for exactly 30 seconds before she was capable of driving. Then she drove home. The news reached Castleford Memorial at around 9 in the morning. Not as a formal announcement. Hospitals didn't receive formal announcements about their employees' middle-of-the-night police detentions. But in the way that news always moved through a hospital, through the nurses' station, through the break room, through the specific gossip economy of people who spent 12-hour shifts in close quarters and had learned to read small signals as a professional survival skill. Charge nurse Dana Quillen heard it from a paramedic who'd heard it from a dispatcher who'd heard it from someone at the borough line. She stood in the break room with her coffee and parsed what she'd been told, and then said, out loud and to nobody in particular, "Of course they did." Her colleague Prentice, sitting across the table with a chart, looked up. "Rourke," Dana said. Dale Rourke from Harlow Heights. You know him? I know the name. He pulled over Nora on her way home this morning, detained her, took her in. Dana sipped her coffee. Federal response team showed up. Prentice put the chart down. Federal. Apparently there's something in their evidence room. Dana's expression was difficult to read. Not surprise exactly, because in 3 years of trauma nursing, she'd stopped being surprised by the particular varieties of institutional failure that occasionally collapsed into her ER. More like the grim satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. Nora's okay. She's home. Prentice was quiet for a moment. Did anyone know about the military thing? I knew she was Navy, Dana said. I didn't know the rest. Did she ever say anything about it? No. Dana looked at her coffee. That's Nora. It was in fact Nora, the particular quality that made her good at the job and occasionally difficult to work alongside, the way she kept everything internal and operational and offered only what the situation required. Other nurses talked about their weekends, their families, the texture of their lives outside the building. Nora brought coffee and did her work and listened to other people's stories without offering much of her own. She was steady. She was reliable. She had carried a man who'd coded twice through a hallway last winter with a calmness that had made a third-year resident stop in the corridor and just watch. Nobody had thought to ask why she was that calm. In the afternoon, the hospital's administrative director, a man named Warren Gosch, who wore lanyards and made decisions with the urgency of someone who understood that institutions could be embarrassed, called a brief meeting. He sat at the head of a small conference table with the charge nurses and department leads, a printed email in front of him, and said that the hospital had been contacted by a federal office regarding an incident involving one of their staff members. She's fine, he said immediately, because the room's energy required it. Nora Vásquez is home and she'll be back for her next shift. He looked at the printed email. We've been asked to provide verification of her employment and shift record from last night. Standard federal investigation support. He paused. I want to be clear that the hospital's full cooperation is being extended. Dana, who was in the meeting, looked at her hands. There's a separate issue, Gosch continued, which is that certain aspects of Ms. Vásquez's background are going to become public record through this process. Background that wasn't widely known here. He looked at the room. Military service. A federal classification. I want us to be prepared for the possibility that media attention... She's not going to want media attention, Dana said. I'm aware she may not want it, Gosch said carefully, but she may not have a choice in... I know, Dana said. I'm just saying. The meeting ended without resolving anything, which was typically how Warren Gosch's meetings ended. He was a competent administrator who processed external crises efficiently and had less skill with the human texture of the things he was administering. Dana walked out into the corridor and pulled out her phone and texted Nora. Heard what happened. Take your sleep. The floor's covered. Nora didn't respond for 3 hours, which meant she was actually sleeping, which Dana took as a good sign. Across town, in a building that was not the Harlow Heights Police Department, but was adjacent to its jurisdiction in ways that mattered, a conversation was happening that was not recorded and was not supposed to be happening at all. Sergeant Marcus Pruitt had 11 years on the force. He was broad-faced, careful with language, the kind of officer who understood that saying the wrong thing left traces and saying nothing left less. He was sitting in a parked car on a side street 6 blocks from the station, and he was on the phone with someone who was not a colleague and not a lawyer and not a family member. It's contained, the voice on the phone said. It's not contained, Pruitt said. There are federal people in the evidence room right now. They won't find anything in the room that isn't already documented. The notebook, Pruitt said. A pause. The kind of pause that had weight in it. What about it? It's in there, Pruitt said. It was in the room. Rourke kept it in the room because he thought it was safe there, and nobody ever told him it wasn't because nobody ever thought this would... He stopped. He started again. The federal woman found it inside an hour. The voice on the phone was quiet for a long moment. Does it have your name in it? Pruitt looked out the car window. A garbage truck was moving slowly down the street. Normal morning, normal block, nothing connected to what was happening 6 blocks away. Not directly, he said. Then you're a witness, not a subject. Aldridge's name is in it. He authorized 11 of the entries. Aldridge is Aldridge's problem. He's going to talk, Pruitt said. If he hasn't already. You know how he is when he's cornered. The voice on the phone said nothing. I need to know what to do, Pruitt said. Do nothing, the voice said. Cooperate with whatever they ask. Answer what you're asked. Volunteer nothing. You were a supervisor who signed off on routine evidence submissions. That's what you were. And if they go deeper than the evidence log? Then you call a lawyer before you say anything else. The voice paused again. This is a local situation. It's not going to be allowed to become something bigger. Pruitt ended the call and sat for a moment. The garbage truck had moved on. The street was quiet. He thought about the notebook, the margin codes. He hadn't written any of the entries himself. He'd understood from the beginning that putting his own handwriting in Rourke's log was the kind of mistake that couldn't be walked back. But he'd known the log existed, and knowing and doing nothing was a proximity to the thing that he was now understanding had a specific weight under federal scrutiny. He pulled back onto the street and drove toward the station. By early afternoon, two things happened within 40 minutes of each other. The first, a federal judge signed an emergency hold on the trial of Marcus Delray, 34, currently in the third week of proceedings in Castleford County Court on charges of possession with intent. The hold was based on a formal submission from FEMRCO's legal office citing newly identified irregularities in the chain of custody of evidence submitted by the Harlow Heights Police Department. The judge, a careful woman named Patricia Sue, who had been on the bench for 16 years, and who had an expression she reserved for situations where the justice system had failed to be what it claimed to be, read the submission twice before signing. In the courtroom, the lead defense attorney received the notification on his phone during a recess, stood up, and had to sit back down. The second, the Castleford Courier's courthouse reporter, a woman named Bex Hartley, who had covered local government for 9 years and had the particular instinct for when a routine story had turned into something else, noticed the emergency hold filing in the court's public record system and started making calls. She called the Harlow Heights Police Department's public affairs line. No answer. She called the county DA's office. The deputy DA, who usually returned press calls within an hour, sent her to voicemail. She called a contact at the federal building in Castleford and was told that a statement would be released in due course. She filed what she had on the Courier's website at 2:17 in the afternoon under the headline, Federal Hold Issued on Castleford Drug Case Amid Reported Police Incident in Harlow Heights. It was 340 words and contained no specifics about Nora Vásquez by name, because Bex Hartley didn't have them yet. By 4 o'clock she had them. A source she'd cultivated over 3 years at the county administrative building sent her a text message with 4 words. Look up Nora Vásquez. And then a second message, 30 seconds later, Castleford Memorial. Navy. Bex looked her up. She found the hospital staff directory. She found a brief mention in a 3-year-old internal newsletter about a trauma nurse joining the team. 1 line, no photograph. She found nothing else because there was nothing else to find. Nora Vásquez had not maintained a social media presence, had not been quoted in any local news, had not appeared in any database that a reporter could access without a subpoena. Which itself, Bex understood, was a kind of information. She updated her story at 4:45 with a paragraph noting that a Castleford Memorial trauma nurse had reportedly been detained by Harlow Heights police following a traffic stop early that morning, that the detention had prompted a federal response, and that a federal hold had subsequently been placed on an active criminal trial. The story was picked up by 2 regional outlets by 6 o'clock. By 8, it had reached a wire service. Nora, asleep in her apartment until 6:30, woke to 3 texts from Dana, one from a number she didn't recognize, and a voicemail from a man who identified himself as a reporter with the Associated Press, asking for any comment she'd like to make. She listened to the voicemail twice. Then she got up, made coffee, and called Harmon. I know, he said, before she said anything. The story's out. How much do they have? The detention, the federal response, the trial hold, your name and employment. A pause. Not the classification, not the unit history, not the specifics of what was in the evidence room beyond the general irregularities framing. Yet, she said. Yet, he agreed. She looked at her coffee. It was 6:48 in the morning. She'd slept for approximately 11 hours, which was more consecutive sleep than she'd had in 6 weeks, and she felt simultaneously more rested than she'd been in months, and completely unprepared for what the day was going to require of her. The follow-up statement, she said. When do you need me in? 9. I'll be there. She ended the call and stood at her kitchen counter and looked out the window at the Castleford morning. January light, flat and gray, the kind that gave nothing away. The building across the street had a diner on the ground floor that opened at 6, and she could see a man inside at the counter with a newspaper, comfortable, ordinary, the morning moving around him at its normal pace. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't have saved, but a Castleford area code. She let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then a text from an unknown number. We'd love to get your side of the story. She turned her phone face down. She was not interested in her side of the story. Her side of the story was a traffic stop, a holding room, 43 minutes on a bench. The part that mattered was the other side. 6 cases, a notebook, a man named Marcus Delray, sitting in a courtroom with an 8-year sentence assembling itself around him, based on evidence that had been manufactured in the same casual way that her trauma kit had been classified as medical supply theft. That was what she'd been thinking about in the 11 hours she'd been asleep, in the particular way that problems work themselves through when the conscious mind released them. Not her bruised wrists, not Rourke's laugh, not even the federal response or the public exposure she now had no way to avoid. Marcus Delray. She'd told Harmon she was coming in at 9. She dressed, ate something without tasting it, and drove to Fimarco's temporary command post, which had been established in a building on Halcyon Street that she hadn't been to before. She was 20 minutes early. Harmon met her in the lobby. He looked like he'd been there all night. There's been a development, he said, and there was something in his voice that was different from the previous night's controlled precision. She waited. We pulled the body camera footage, he said. All of it. Rourke's camera from the traffic stop, plus station footage, plus Gentry's camera. He paused. Rourke's body camera was switched off during a portion of the stop. The gap is 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The timeline places that gap at the point when he opened the trunk. She looked at him. That's when he found the trauma kit, she said. Yes. He turned off his camera before he found the credential case. Yes. Harmon looked at her steadily. That's not something you do accidentally. Body cameras in Harlow Heights have a mandatory on protocol during active stops. Turning it off is a deliberate action. Nora absorbed that. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of no footage, covering exactly the moment when Rourke had removed the credential case from her trunk. No recording of how he'd handled it. No recording of what he'd said. No recording of whether he'd looked at the verification protocol printed on the back of the credential, the 40-second phone call that Wren had described to the room the previous night. The notebook, she said. Have you decoded the margin notations? Partially. Harmon led her toward a side room where a table had been set up with printed pages. The codes correspond to case disposition. We've identified a notation that appears next to 9 of the 14 entries, a letter number combination. We think it indicates which cases were forwarded to the DA's office and which were handled internally. She looked at the pages. The handwriting was precise, the columns clean, the record of someone who'd done this enough times to develop a system, the same system applied consistently across 18 months. 9, she said. You said 9 with that notation. Yes. You originally told me 6 went to the DA's office. Harmon was quiet. What happened to the other 3? She asked. He picked up one of the printed pages. We're working on that. She looked at the page in his hand. The column of dates, the coded notations, the names. She could see the names now, printed in the federal team's transcription, the names Rourke had written next to each stop. Names, vehicle descriptions, locations, and beside each one, the notation that meant something in the system Rourke had built. One name stopped her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Harmon. This one, she said, pointing. Second column, entry 11, the name and the notation beside it. Harmon looked at the entry. That's one of the 3 we're still working on, he said carefully. The notation beside it is different from the others, Nora said. The letter number code is the same, but there's an additional mark. You see that? He looked more closely. That mark, she said, appears in Rourke's column for this entry, and then it appears again in the authorization line. She traced the column with her finger without touching the page. Except the authorization line for this entry isn't Aldridge's signature. Look at it. Harmon looked. He was very still for a moment. That's not Aldridge, he said slowly. No, Nora said. It's not. The room was quiet except for the building's ventilation, and somewhere beyond the door the sound of the investigation moving through its ordinary morning machinery, phones, keyboards, voices in the hallway. Normal sounds for an abnormal situation that had just, in the space of 30 seconds, expanded in a direction that neither of them had anticipated. Harmon reached for his phone and called Wren. Wren arrived in 11 minutes. That was faster than the building's elevator and parking situation should have allowed, which told Nora he'd been close, either in the building or in a vehicle outside it, the kind of proximity that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this sort of development without knowing its shape yet. He came through the door of the side room without preamble, looked at Harmon, looked at Nora, and then looked at the printed page on the table. "Show me," he said. Nora pointed to entry 11. The date, the name, the vehicle description, the notation code, and then the authorization line, the signature that was not Aldridge's, that was clearly different from every other authorization on the log, written in a tighter hand with a forward lean that belonged to someone else entirely. Wren looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Who else has seen this page?" he asked. "Rios flagged the log last night," Harmon said. "The transcription team printed these this morning. I was looking at them with Lieutenant Vásquez when she identified the discrepancy." Wren straightened. He had the expression of someone running probability assessments in real time, the outcomes, the implications, the order in which things needed to happen now versus later. "I need the original notebook under a second forensic pass, specifically the authorization lines. I want a handwriting comparison against every sworn officer in Harlow Heights. That's 43 people," Harmon said. "Start with supervisors and work down." Wren looked at Nora. "You spotted this." "The code pattern was inconsistent," she said. "Everything else in that column follows the same notation rhythm. Entry 11 breaks it." "You have training in pattern recognition?" 8 years of field medicine. You learn to notice when something doesn't match the baseline." Wren considered her for a moment, not assessing exactly, more like confirming something he'd already concluded. "I want you in the briefing at 11, he said, "not as a witness, as an observer with read access to the relevant documentation." Harmon looked at him. That was outside protocol, and both of them knew it. "Her credential classification gives her the clearance," Wren said. "And she's been 3 steps ahead of us on this document since 9 this morning." He picked up the printed page. "I want to know whose signature that is before we bring Aldridge in for formal questioning." He left. Harmon looked at Nora. "You should have stayed home," he said, but without any real conviction behind it. "I was 20 minutes early," she said. "Well, the handwriting comparison took until 10:40. Rios ran it against the personnel files, the sworn statements, the evidence log authorizations, the standard departmental forms that every officer in Harlow Heights had signed at some point in the last 3 years. It was painstaking and imperfect. Handwriting comparison was not the clean science it appeared to be in courtroom presentations, and Rios was careful to note the margin of error in her preliminary finding. But the preliminary finding was, within a confidence range she was willing to put her name on, sufficient to move. The signature on entry 11 belonged to Sergeant Marcus Pruitt. Wren received the finding at 10:53. At 11:01, 2 federal officers drove to the Harlow Heights Police Department, where Pruitt had returned that morning and had been cooperating with the documentary review with the careful compliance of a man who'd been told by someone to say nothing beyond the minimum. They brought him to the Halcyon Street command post in the back of a federal vehicle. Nora was in the briefing room when they walked him past the window in the hallway. She saw him through the glass, broad-shouldered, controlled, the kind of man who'd built his composure into something structural over many years. But there was something in the set of his jaw when he passed the window, something that registered at a frequency she recognized from trauma patients who were working very hard not to show that they were in pain. He knew the signature had been found. The briefing proceeded without her directly, Wren and a federal attorney in one room with Pruitt, Harmon running the documentation review in another room, Rios continuing the forensic pass in a third. Nora sat at a table with read access to the case files as Wren had promised, which meant she was looking at the full evidence log, the decoded notation system, and the preliminary finding on the 9 cases flagged for external disposition. She read carefully. The picture that assembled itself across the documents was not complicated once you understood the structure. Rourke ran the stops. He selected vehicles. The selection criteria weren't random, and the notebook documented this, though the full analysis of the pattern would take longer than they'd had. When a stop yielded something that could be logged as evidence, Rourke logged it. When it didn't, he sometimes logged it anyway. The hemostatic gauze in her trunk had been flagged as unidentified medical substance, the same language used for actual controlled substances in 3 of the 14 entries. The cases that went to the DA's office were the ones where the logged evidence was sufficient for charges. 6, initially. Then the notation discrepancy opened the possibility of 3 more that had been handled differently, not through the DA, but through some other channel that the notation code indicated without specifying. Pruitt's signature on entry 11 was the thread. She was still reading when Harmon came in and sat across from her. "Pruitt is talking," he said. "How much?" "Enough." Harmon put a folder on the table. The 3 cases that weren't sent to the DA, they were handled through a different mechanism. Pruitt was facilitating a secondary arrangement. People who were stopped and didn't have the profile for a clean prosecution, but who could be pressured in other ways. He paused. Civil asset forfeiture. Cash, vehicles, property. Logged as evidence, never returned. Nora looked at the folder. Pruitt signed off on the forfeiture authorizations, Harmon said. Aldridge didn't know about those 3 specifically, or that's what Pruitt is claiming. Aldridge's exposure was the 6 DA cases. Pruitt had his own operation running alongside. She opened the folder. The forfeiture records were there. 3 separate authorizations, 3 separate property logs, cash amounts, and vehicle descriptions and the names of the people they'd been taken from. "These people got their things back?" she asked. "No," Harmon said. "The property was liquidated. Standard forfeiture processing. By the time anyone would have had grounds to contest it, the window had passed." She looked at the cash amounts. They weren't large numbers individually, a few $1,000s each, the kind of sum that would devastate a working family and barely register in a departmental budget line. The efficiency of the cruelty was specific. It targeted people who had enough to lose and not enough to fight. "Who is Pruitt calling?" she asked. Harmon looked at her. "Why do you ask that?" "He made a call this morning. Before he came back to the station. Cell records would show it." She looked at the folder. "He was told to say nothing. That's not instinct, that's instruction. Someone told him what to do." Harmon was quiet for a moment. "We've requested the cell records." "The signature on entry 11, the fact that he signed it at all. That's the kind of mistake people make when they think they're protected," she said. "When they believe the situation is stable enough that documentation doesn't matter." She closed the folder. "Someone made him feel protected." "We're working that angle," Harmon said. "How long has this been going on?" "Beyond the 18-month window of the log." "That's the question we can't answer yet from the documents we have." He looked at her steadily. "The log started 18 months ago. That doesn't mean the practice started 18 months ago." She let that sit. In the next room, muffled through the wall, she could hear a voice. She couldn't make out words, but the rhythm of it was the rhythm of someone answering questions in measured increments, giving what they'd calculated they had to give, and holding the rest. She'd heard that rhythm before. It had a ceiling. "There's something else," Harmon said, and his voice changed slightly, not lower, but more careful. She waited. "The reporter from the Courier, Bex Hartley. She's been making calls all morning." He put a second folder on the table, thinner. "She contacted the hospital. She contacted the county administrative office. She's filed 2 updates to her original story." He paused. "The wire service pickup has generated national interest. We've received inquiries from 4 major outlets." "I know," Nora said. "I had 3 voicemails when I woke up." "By this afternoon, your name and photograph are going to be in circulation in ways that go beyond what the Courier has right now." He looked at her. "The federal classification is still protected, but the military service history, your deployment record, your separation date, that's all accessible through standard public records requests. Someone is going to file one today, if they haven't already." She absorbed that. She'd known this was coming from the moment Harmon had told her in the interview room. The classification becoming public record, the exposure she couldn't avoid. She'd accepted it as an abstraction at 6 in the morning. Now, sitting in the Halcyon Street command post at 11:15, with the investigation expanding around her, it had become concrete. 8 years she'd kept it quiet. Not because she was ashamed of it. The work had been real. The cost of it had been real. And she'd carried both without apology. But she'd chosen civilian life deliberately, chosen the hospital and the scrubs and the badge that said her name and her department and nothing else. And she'd built something in that space that was hers without needing to be explained. "I'm not giving interviews," she said. "I understand. Whatever they print, they print." She looked at the window. "It doesn't change the cases." "No," Harmon said. "It doesn't." She stood up. "I want to see the full forfeiture documentation when Rios has it processed, and the cell records when they come in." She looked at him. "I'm going to go get something to eat. I'll be back in an hour." He nodded. She left. She didn't go far. A sandwich place 2 blocks from the command post, the kind of place with laminate tables and a television on the wall showing the midday news. She sat with her back to the television and ate without tasting much and thought about the pattern in the notebook, about the authorization discrepancy, about Pruitt's phone call and the voice on the other end of it telling him to cooperate carefully and say nothing. She thought about the forfeiture cases, the names in the file. 3 families, 3 situations, 3 episodes of casual legal violence that had been executed with the same indifference that Rourke had applied to her trauma kit. Here's a thing, here's a label I'll put on it, here's what happens next. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, area code she didn't know. She looked at it. Let it go to voicemail. Then immediately after, a text from the same number. "Lieutenant Vásquez. This is Attorney Patricia Dell, Federal Public Defender's Office, Castleford County. I represent Marcus Delray. I understand you may have information relevant to my client's case. If you're willing to speak, I'd appreciate a call at your convenience." Nora read the text twice. Then she looked up the Federal Public Defender's Office for Castleford County on her phone, found the main number, called it, and asked for Patricia Dell. "This is Dell." "This is Nora Vásquez. You just texted me." A brief pause. "Lieutenant Vásquez, thank you for calling." The attorney's voice was brisk, controlled, someone who moved fast and had learned to lead with the relevant thing. "I want to be direct with you. The emergency hold has suspended my client's trial, but suspension isn't dismissal. The DA's office is arguing that the evidence irregularities don't affect the underlying merits of the case. I need documentation, the kind that establishes that the evidence against my client originated from the same operational pattern you experienced." "I can't share federal investigation documents," Nora said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking whether you're willing to make a statement to the court directly, not through the federal case, but as a parallel witness in the criminal proceeding. Your experience of how Rourke operates, how he categorizes items, the specific language he used." A pause. "The hemostatic gauze classified as an unidentified substance. That language pattern, if it matches the language in my client's evidence documentation, it's relevant to establishing systematic fabrication." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to talk to Harmon," she said. "Of course. But I'm not opposed to it," she said. "If it's legally appropriate and Harmon clears it, I'm not opposed." She could hear something shift on Dell's end, not relief exactly, but the particular exhale of a person who'd been braced for refusal. "Thank you," Dell said. "I'll reach out to your federal contact directly to coordinate." Nora ended the call and finished her sandwich and walked back to the command post. The afternoon moved fast in the way that afternoons move, when the structure of a situation is changing shape faster than any individual component can track. The cell records for Pruitt arrived at 1:47. The call he'd made from the parked car that morning, 6 blocks from the station, 11 minutes long, had been to a number registered to a burner phone. Dead end on that line. But Pruitt's call history showed a pattern of contact with that number going back 4 months, and the same number appeared in Rourke's call history, which the federal team had also subpoenaed. Rourke and Pruitt calling the same unregistered number regularly over 4 months. Wren looked at the call history and said nothing for nearly a full minute. "We need to find that phone," he said finally. "Active or inactive, we need the device." The second thing that happened in the afternoon, Aldridge broke. He'd been in a federal interview room since 11 in the morning, and he'd been doing what men in his position typically did, answering the questions he couldn't avoid and deflecting the ones he thought he could, maintaining the posture of a man who'd made administrative oversights rather than deliberate choices. Then Harmon's team showed him the decoded notation system from the notebook and told him that 6 cases he'd authorized had been forwarded to the DA's office based on fabricated evidence. They told him that one of those cases was an active trial. They told him the trial was on hold pending federal review. They told him that the DA's office was aware and was cooperating. Aldridge looked at the wall for a while. Then he asked for his attorney to be called. His attorney arrived at 2:15. They conferred for 8 minutes. Then Aldridge's attorney told the federal interviewer that his client had information relevant to the investigation and was prepared to share it in exchange for consideration of his cooperation in any subsequent proceedings. Harmon came to find Nora in the documentation room. "He's going to tell us about the phone," Harmon said. Nora looked up from the forfeiture files. "He knows who owns it," Harmon said. "He's been protecting that information since this morning. His attorney just told us he's ready to disclose." She put the file down. "Who is it?" she asked. Harmon looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not hesitation, but something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who'd found a number they hadn't expected. "Deputy Commissioner Leonard Farr," he said, "Castleford County Sheriff's Office." The room was very quiet. Nora understood, in the space of about 3 seconds, the full architecture of what she was looking at. Farr was not Harlow Heights. Farr was county level. Harlow Heights was a borough department, technically separate, operationally adjacent, the kind of relationship where a county official could extend protection downward without leaving clean fingerprints. Rourke and Pruitt running stops. Evidence logged. Cases forwarded. Forfeitures processed. And above all of it, a county deputy commissioner whose phone had been called from a parked car 6 blocks from the station by a man who'd been told to cooperate carefully and say nothing. "How long?" she asked. Aldridge says Farr was involved from the beginning. Not operationally. He didn't direct specific stops, but he knew. He provided cover when cases needed to move through the system without attracting scrutiny. And when I activated the transmitter, someone in the county system would have known about it before Aldridge came in from off-duty, Harmon said. Aldridge didn't call himself. He was called. She thought about the 43 minutes on the bench, the carefully tighter cuffs, the evidence bag, the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of missing body camera footage. A local officer making a mistake was one thing. A local officer operating under the protection of a county official was a system. "Farr doesn't know yet," she said. "Not officially," Harmon said. "We haven't approached him. He'll know soon. If he has sources inside, we're moving on that." Harmon looked at her steadily. "Wren is coordinating with the county sheriff's office directly. Not through Farr's chain. The sheriff himself is being briefed right now." She sat back in her chair. The documentation around her, the forfeiture files, the evidence-logged transcriptions, the cell record printouts, had taken on a different weight. Not larger in itself, but connected to something larger. "The people who were stopped," she said. "The 3 forfeiture cases. The 6 criminal cases." She looked at the names in the file. How many of them knew any of this? "None of them," Harmon said. "They thought they'd been stopped and prosecuted and penalized by a functioning system." "Yes." She looked at her hands. The bruising on her wrists had gone through its progression, darker now, more defined, the yellow edge of it starting at the periphery. She'd treated enough bruising to know that this stage was just cosmetic, that there was nothing functionally impaired, that it would resolve in 7 to 10 days without intervention. She knew this precisely, and it didn't make it feel like less. "I'm going to be at the hospital tonight," she said. "I have a shift at 6. Harmon looked at her. "Lieutenant, the case is moving. You have Aldridge's cooperation. You have the cell records. You know about Farr." She held his gaze. "You don't need me in this building for the next phase. If something changes and you do, call me." He looked at her for a moment. "The media situation is going to be worse by tonight. There were 2 news vans outside the hospital this afternoon." "I know." "Do you want someone?" "No," she said. "I don't need someone." She picked up her jacket. She looked at the documentation on the table. Months of stops, months of fabricated evidence, months of a system that had been allowed to run because enough people above it had decided that what it produced was worth what it cost, and what it cost had always been paid by someone else. She walked out into the hallway. Wren was coming toward her from the direction of the interview rooms. He stopped when he saw her expression. "Going to work?" he said. "Shift at 6. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face, not approval, because he wasn't the kind of person who trafficked in approval, but something that recognized her the way recognition actually works, which is quietly and without fanfare. "Dell called us," he said. "The public defender. We're going to facilitate your statement to the court. It's appropriate, and I'll sign off on it." "Thank you." "The FAR situation is going to move tonight," he said. "It's going to be public by morning." She nodded. "When it breaks," he said, "your name is going to be attached to the whole thing in ways that go beyond the traffic stop. The media has the stop and the detention. When they get FAR, they're going to want the thread that pulled it loose." He paused. "That thread is you." She looked at him steadily. "The thread is the notebook," she said. "I just read it." Something shifted in Ren's expression. Not quite a smile, not with the weight of what was in those rooms behind them, but the acknowledgement of a person who'd said the right thing. She walked toward the exit. Outside, the January afternoon had gone gray and the temperature had dropped from the morning. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it, hands on the wheel. Her shift started in 4.5 hours. She needed to go home, change, eat something real, and drive to Castleford Memorial. She started the car. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Not a call, a news alert from an app she'd installed years ago and checked rarely. The headline had come through from a regional outlet that had been running updates all day. She read it. Sources: Castleford County Deputy Commissioner named in expanding Harlow Heights police corruption probe. She put the phone face down. FAR knew. If the outlet had it, FAR knew. And a man who'd been running cover for an operation like this for as long as Aldridge was suggesting was not a man who'd wait passively for a federal team to come to his door. He had resources. He had contacts. He had, somewhere in the structure of his professional life, the same kind of exit calculations that Pruitt had been running from a parked car that morning. She called Harmon. He picked up immediately. "The story's out," she said. "I know. We just saw it." "FAR. We're moving now," Harmon said. "Tonight, not morning." "Okay." She paused. "Is there anything you need from me before my shift?" "No." A beat. "Go to work, Lieutenant." She pulled out of the parking spot and drove toward the main road. 2 blocks from the command post, she passed a news van moving in the opposite direction, one of the regional outlets, camera equipment visible through the window, moving with the focused urgency of people who'd just received a location. Moving toward Halcyon Street. She drove on. At the next light, her phone rang again. Not a number she recognized. She let it ring. Then, while she waited for the light, a second call came in on a different line, the federal secondary number, the one only a small number of people had. She picked up. Lieutenant Vásquez. Not Harmon. Not Ren. A voice she hadn't heard before, female, with the flat professional cadence of someone reading from a briefing. "This is Special Agent Renata Ochoa, FBI Field Office, Castleford. We've been brought into the investigation as of 1400 hours today." Nora waited. "I'm calling because we've just received information that changes the scope of the federal inquiry," Ochoa said. "Information that directly affects your situation." "What information?" A pause. The kind of pause that carried weight. "We've located the burner phone," Ochoa said. "The device linked to the calls between Pruitt, Rourke, and Deputy Commissioner Farr." Another pause. "The phone wasn't in Farr's possession. We found it in a drop location that was accessed yesterday, less than 12 hours before your traffic stop." Nora's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "The location," Ochoa said, "was a storage unit registered to a shell company. Inside the storage unit, along with the phone, we found documentation, operational documentation, names, stop schedules, target profiles." A pause. "Lieutenant Vásquez, your name is in that documentation." The light turned green. Nora didn't move. "My name," she said. "Your vehicle. Your route. Your shift schedule at Castleford Memorial." Ochoa's voice was steady. The practiced steadiness of someone delivering information they understood was significant. "The stop this morning was not random. You were profiled in advance. Someone knew you drove that route. Someone knew what was in your car." Behind her, a car horn. She registered it from a distance. "Someone told them about the credential," she said. A pause. "We think so," Ochoa said. "We don't yet know who." The car behind her honked again. Nora put the Civic in gear and moved through the intersection, her hands steady on the wheel even as the rest of her processed what Ochoa had just said. She pulled to the curb half a block past the light and sat there with the engine running. "Walk me through the documentation," she said. "What specifically was in it?" "Vehicle description, license plate, shift schedule, Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday night into Monday morning. The route from Castleford Memorial to your apartment, with the Harlow Heights Borough section highlighted." Ochoa paused. "There was a notation beside your name. We're still working the notation system, but given what your team decoded from the notebook, we believe it's the same coding." "The same coding Rourke used?" "Yes." "Which means whoever prepared that documentation was working from the same system," Nora said. "The same person, or someone trained on the same method." "That's our current assessment." She looked at the street ahead. Ordinary afternoon, ordinary Castleford, people moving on the sidewalk with no awareness that anything had shifted. "The credential," she said. "Who knew about it outside the federal structure?" "That's the question we're trying to answer. The classification is protected, but your reserve status would appear in certain interagency databases that law enforcement at the county level can access under specific circumstances. Narcotics Task Force Coordination, Joint Operations. There are authorized query pathways. FAR has access to those pathways." "He does. But accessing your file without a legitimate operational reason would leave a query log." Ochoa paused. "We pulled it this afternoon. There was a query on your Federal Reserve classification 9 weeks ago from a county-level terminal." 9 weeks. Nora did the arithmetic without trying to. 9 weeks ago was mid-November. She'd worked a double on the Thursday, driven home through Harlow Heights, because it was 2 minutes faster than the alternate route at that hour, and thought nothing of it. "Which terminal?" she asked. "We're tracing it now. The terminal is registered to the Castleford County Sheriff's Administrative Office." A pause. "Not FAR's personal terminal, a shared administrative workstation." Meaning it could have been FAR, or it could have been someone in his office, someone adjacent to him, someone who'd run the query on his behalf and left less of a trail than a direct access would have. It was the same operational pattern, never the principal directly, always one layer of distance. "I'm going to park," Nora said. "I'll be at the command post in 5 minutes." "There's something else," Ochoa said, and her voice shifted slightly, not in volume, but in texture, the shift of someone who'd been holding the harder part for last. "The storage unit, the documentation, the phone, we're confident FAR had access to it. But the unit was rented under the shell company 14 months ago. 14 months. The evidence log went back 18 months. The shell company's storage unit went back 14. Someone set this up before FAR was involved, Nora said. Or FAR was involved earlier than the shell company formation, Ochoa said. We don't know yet. What we know is that the infrastructure for this operation, the drop location, the burner system, the documentation protocol, is more organized than a county deputy commissioner with a rogue patrol officer. This has the shape of something that was designed. Nora sat with that. Designed. Not opportunistic corruption that had grown over time, not a single bad officer who'd escalated, not even a supervisor protecting someone who'd gotten out of hand. Designed. Structure first, then personnel, then operation. Someone had looked at a borough police department in a wealthy adjacent neighborhood, identified its use, and built a system around it. Who benefits from the forfeiture revenue, she asked. The standard legal framework routes civil asset forfeiture through the seizing department, Ochoa said. But there are mechanisms, specifically if a county narcotics task force is nominally involved in a case, where the revenue can be redirected through a task force account. FAR chairs the county narcotics task force. There it was. The stops were generating forfeiture revenue that was flowing through the task force, Nora said. Partially. We're still untangling the financial structure. But yes, the shape of it is there. She pulled the car back into traffic. I'm coming back to the command post. Wren met her in the lobby. He'd clearly just come from a briefing and had the focused, slightly compressed quality of someone operating at a pace that didn't allow for wasted motion. Ochoa called you, he said. Yes. Good, come on. He moved toward the elevator without waiting, and she followed. We've been coordinating with the FBI since 2 o'clock. This is their jurisdiction now, financial crimes, organized corruption at the county level. We retain the FEMRSCO angle, which is your detention and the federal credential violation. But the larger case is theirs. Farr is still at large, she said. He's at his office. He came in at 2:30 this morning, which is unusual for a deputy commissioner, and he's been there since. His vehicle hasn't moved. Wren looked at her as the elevator opened. He may think he's ahead of this. He may be trying to manage it from the inside. He's not ahead of it. No, Wren said. He's not. The command post had expanded since morning. The FBI's arrival had doubled the personnel and transformed the room from a federal medical response operation into something more complex. More screens, more documentation, the specific intensity of multiple agencies working from the same information toward coordinated conclusions. Ochoa was at a center table. She was in her early 40s, compact, with the kind of attention that made you feel assessed, and not unintelligently so. She stood when Nora came in, which was either courtesy or the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood what Nora's role in this had been. Lieutenant Vásquez, she said, I wanted you here when we go through the financial documentation. Why me specifically? Nora asked. Ochoa looked at her directly. Because the query on your federal file 9 weeks ago is what pushed this from opportunistic corruption into organized criminal enterprise under federal statute. Your detention this morning is what triggered the federal response. And you identified the signature discrepancy on entry 11 of the log before my team had even been called in. She paused. I want you to look at what we have on the financial structure and tell me if you see anything my analysts aren't seeing. It was not a typical request. It was also not an offer Nora was inclined to decline. She sat down. The financial documentation was dense: forfeiture records, task force budget reports, interagency transfer authorizations going back 3 years. The analysts had flagged the obvious: the forfeiture revenue flowing through the task force account, the task force account authorizations bearing Farr's signature, the timeline correlation between the Harlow Heights stops and the task force deposits. It was a clean pattern once you could see it, the kind of pattern that had been obscured by paperwork volume and institutional familiarity, everyone assuming that someone else had reviewed the authorizations, everyone treating the task force account as routine. Nora read through it methodically. At the 3rd page of the task force budget reports, she stopped. This line item, she said, pointing, personnel deployment reimbursements, 3rd quarter, 2 years ago. Ochoa's analyst, a young man named Torres, who'd been watching her read, leaned in. It's within normal range for task force operations, Torres said. It's within normal range if you have personnel deployed to field operations, Nora said. But the task force activity log for that quarter shows no field deployments. All the activity logged is administrative. She looked at the numbers. Someone got reimbursed for field deployment that didn't appear in the activity log. Torres pulled up the activity log on his screen. He was quiet for a moment. She's right, he said. Cross-reference the reimbursement authorization with the personnel roster, Ochoa said. It took Torres 4 minutes. The reimbursement had been authorized for 3 individuals. One of them was on the task force roster. 2 were not. They appeared in the payroll system as contracted consultants, with a contract authorization that traced back to a services agreement signed 18 months before the reimbursement. 18 months. When the evidence log had started. The consultants, Nora said. What services does the contract specify? Torres read from the screen. Operational support and community liaison services for county narcotics reduction initiatives. The room was quiet. They were on the payroll before the operation started, Ochoa said slowly. The contract predates the evidence log by 6 months. Someone built the financial structure first, Nora said, set up the payment mechanism. Then the operation started generating the revenue to run through it. She looked at Ochoa. The 2 consultants, who are they? Torres ran the names. One came back clean, a retired county employee with a legitimate consulting history. The other came back to a registered address that belonged to a property management company, which belonged to a holding company, which was registered in a state with minimal disclosure requirements and had been incorporated 11 months before the task force contract was signed. A shell inside a shell. The storage unit, Nora said. The one with the burner phone and the documentation. What was the shell company that rented it? Ochoa looked at Torres. Torres ran it. He looked up from his screen with an expression she recognized from the moments in a trauma bay when a result came back and told you something you'd hoped it wouldn't. Same holding company, he said. Different subsidiary, but the same parent. Well, The arrest of Deputy Commissioner Leonard Farr happened at 6:17 in the evening. Nora was not there. She was at Castleford Memorial, 40 minutes into her shift, standing at the nurse's station with a patient chart open in front of her and Dana Quillen beside her pretending to review scheduling while actually watching the news feed on her phone under the counter. "It's happening," Dana said quietly. Nora didn't look up from the chart. "I know." "How do you know? You're looking at a chart." "Because it was going to happen at 6 and it's 6:18. Dana looked at her. She'd been doing that more than usual tonight, the particular look of someone reassembling a picture they'd thought was complete. "There are reporters in the parking lot," she said. "I know. 3 of them." "Okay." "Nora." Dana waited until she looked up. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, the kind that required an honest answer or no answer. Nora considered it the way she considered a chart, what the information actually showed, not what she wanted it to say. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm here, and the work is the same as it was yesterday." Dana held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay." She pocketed her phone. "Bed 3 is going to need a full reassessment in 20 minutes. The attending thinks he's escalating." "I'll take it," Nora said. She went to bed 3. The patient was 51, post-surgical complication from an appendectomy done 2 days prior at a different hospital, transferred in that afternoon. His name was Garrett, and he had the look of a man who was trying to pretend the pain was manageable because he'd already decided that hospitals were places where the news got worse. She'd seen that look enough times to know how to work with it. She did her assessment without rushing, talked to him in the flat, informational way that worked better than comfort voice for people who needed to believe they were being treated seriously, documented everything accurately. His situation was not good and was going to require a conversation with the attending about escalating to surgical review, which she flagged before leaving the bedside. The work was the same as it was yesterday. That was the thing about trauma nursing. It didn't make room for the rest of your life to intrude. The intrusion happened before and after, in the parking lot and the drive home, and the 11 hours of sleep and the morning with the notification sound and Harmon's voice and the documents on the table. Inside the building, the work was the work, and it required the same things it always required, and she was good at it for reasons that had nothing to do with what was happening 4 miles away at the Castleford County Administrative Building. At 7:40, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She was between patients. She stepped into the corridor and checked it. Harmon, Farr in custody. Charges filed. Statement going out in 30. She put the phone back and went to check on Garrett. The federal statement went out at 8:03. It was measured and specific in the way that federal statements were, when the underlying situation was legally complex, but the public communication needed to be clean. It named Farr, named Rourke, named Pruitt. It named Aldridge. It described the federal investigation into civil rights violations, evidence tampering, civil asset forfeiture abuse, and organized corruption at the county level. It noted that the investigation had been triggered by the unlawful detention of a federal medical reserve officer during a traffic stop in Harlow Heights Borough in the early hours of that morning. It did not name Nora. That was Wren's doing, she found out later, a deliberate choice to protect the federal classification from the public statement, even as it became technically accessible through the legal proceedings. He'd argued it with the FBI legal office for 40 minutes, and won on the narrow ground that the credential itself was the federal interest, and the individual holder's identity was secondary to the institutional violation, she found out later. That night she worked. The reporters in the parking lot were still there at midnight when she came out for a break. She saw them from the staff exit. 2 had given up, but 1 remained, a woman in a gray coat sitting in a running car with a camera on the passenger seat. Nora looked at her for a moment, then went back inside. At 2 in the morning, something broke in the ER in the way things broke that required everyone to be exactly where they were supposed to be and do exactly what the situation required. A multi-vehicle accident on the interstate, 4 patients, 2 critical. She worked for 90 minutes in a sustained, focused state that left no room for anything else. And when the immediate crisis had stabilized and the 2 critical patients were in surgery and the other 2 were in observation, she stood in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 2 and breathed. Dana came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. "You should go eat something," Dana said finally. "I will." "Now, Nora." She went and ate something. Bad vending machine coffee and a sandwich from the break room refrigerator that had been there since yesterday. And she sat at the table and looked at the wall and thought about the things she always thought about in the break room at 2 in the morning. Not the big things, not Farr or Rourke or the forfeiture cases, but the immediate things. The 2 patients in surgery, the family members who'd been brought into the waiting area, the attending's assessment of the less critical patients. Her phone was face down on the table. She turned it over. 3 missed calls from numbers she didn't know. A text from Harmon. "Call me when you have a minute. Not urgent, but tonight if possible." She called him. "The financial structure," he said when he answered. The analyst finished the trace on the holding company, the second-layer consultant, the shell entity. "Yes. It goes back further than we thought. The holding company was incorporated 4 years ago." He paused. "Farr has been on the narcotics task force for 4 years. She absorbed that. He built it before he had the operation to run through it. Before Rourke was even in the position he held. Rourke was transferred to Harlow Heights 3.5 years ago from a different borough department. We're looking at whether the transfer was facilitated. Someone had placed Rourke in Harlow Heights. Someone had looked at the borough, wealthy, adjacent to lower income areas, with an understaffed oversight structure, and had identified it as useful, and then had put a specific officer in a specific position to run a specific operation. The people who were stopped, Nora said, the profiling, it was systematic from the beginning. Yes, the documentation from the storage unit goes back further than the evidence log. There are profiles that predate Rourke's transfer. Someone was surveilling target populations before the stop operation even began. She looked at the wall of the break room. The bulletin board with its rotation of staff notices and a CPR recertification flyer and a birthday card someone had taped up for a colleague. Normal, ordinary, the texture of a workplace. "Who filed the query on my federal classification?" she asked. "Did you find the terminal trace?" "The terminal is registered to the administrative pool in the county sheriff's office," Harmon said. "We've identified 2 people who had access to that terminal in the relevant window. One of them is a clerk with no connection to the task force. The other is a captain in the narcotics division, a man named Voss. He reports directly to Farr." Voss. A name she didn't know, which meant he'd been operating entirely outside the parts of this investigation that had been visible to her. A captain in the division, direct report to Farr, with access to an interagency database that could pull a Federal Reserve classification for a trauma nurse in Castleford. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of everyone who drives through Harlow Heights." Harmon was quiet for a moment. "We think it was the route. You drove it consistently on your shift nights. Same time window, same section of the borough. You would have appeared in whatever surveillance system they were running for vehicle profiling. When they ran the plate and it came back to a medical professional, someone decided to dig further." He paused. "The credential query suggests they found the classification and it concerned them. A Federal Medical Reserve officer driving a regular route through their operational territory. They wanted to see what I knew," she said. "Or they wanted to see what would happen if they tested you," Harmon said. "Whether activating the stop would produce a federal response. Whether the credential was active." She thought about that. Testing whether the credential was active, which meant they'd been concerned for some time that their operation might be exposed, and they'd been looking for signals about how close any exposure might be. "They didn't think I'd activate the transmitter," she said. "Nobody who hasn't worked in that structure would think someone carries an active emergency transmitter in a trauma kit," Harmon said. "It's not a standard item. Most people with reserve classifications keep the credential as a formality. The transmitter is an operational choice. She'd kept it operational because the unit had asked her to, and because she'd agreed it was reasonable, and because 8 years of field medicine had given her a practical relationship with emergency equipment that made keeping it inactive feel like carrying a car jack with a broken handle." "Voss," she said, "is he in custody?" "We're bringing him in tomorrow morning. We want the documentation complete before we move on him." "He'll know before tomorrow morning." "Probably," Harmon said. "We've got eyes on him. Farr's been in custody for hours. If Voss has a contact inside the county building who told him Farr went down." "We're aware of the timeline pressure," Harmon said, and she heard something in his voice that suggested the Voss situation was more complicated than he was currently able to say on a phone call. "Okay," she said. "I'll let you work." She ended the call and finished the bad coffee and went back to the floor. Chub. At 4:15 in the morning, Bex Hartley published her 3rd update to the Courier story. It had moved far beyond the original 340 words. This version ran to nearly 2,000, with a detailed account of the federal charges against Farr, the financial structure of the task force operation, the civil asset forfeiture mechanism, and the status of the 6 criminal cases now under review. She named Rourke, Pruitt, Aldridge, and Farr. She had quotes from the federal public statement and a comment from the county sheriff, who had issued a separate statement expressing his full cooperation with the federal investigation and noting that he had not been aware of Farr's activities. Near the bottom of the story, she had a paragraph that read, "The federal investigation was triggered by the detention of a Castleford Memorial trauma nurse during a traffic stop in Harlow Heights Borough early Tuesday morning. The nurse, who has not been named in federal statements, activated an emergency alert that brought federal medical response personnel to the scene within the hour." According to sources familiar with the investigation, the nurse's background includes military medical service, and the credentials she carried during the stop proved central to establishing the federal jurisdiction that expanded the scope of what might otherwise have remained a local matter. She had not named Nora, but she'd described her with enough specificity that anyone who knew her would know. At 5:30 in the morning, Nora's shift ended. She changed in the locker room and walked out through the staff exit into the pre-dawn cold. The reporter in the gray coat was gone. The parking lot was quiet, the overnight quiet of a hospital campus at the edge of morning. She stood for a moment in the cold air and let herself feel the exhaustion, not the functional exhaustion of a long shift, but the deeper kind that came from 36 hours of sustained intensity across contexts she hadn't expected to occupy simultaneously. She drove home the long way. Not through Harlow Heights. She drove through the center of Castleford, the pre-dawn streets empty, the streetlights still on, the city quiet in the specific way it was quiet at this hour. And she thought about Marcus Delray's trial on hold, and the 3 families whose forfeited property was gone and couldn't be recovered, and the 2 people in surgery who'd come in last night through no fault of their own, and the patient named Garrett who was scared and trying not to show it, and the way the notebook had been sitting in the evidence room with its careful columns and its coded notations, 18 months of deliberate harm filed and cross-referenced. She parked outside her building and sat in the car for a moment. Her phone lit up. Not a call, an email notification which she usually ignored at this hour, but the sender name made her look. It was from the FEMRSCO legal office, flagged priority. She opened it. It was addressed to her and copied to Wren and Harmon and Ochoa. It was brief, 3 paragraphs, the clinical language of a legal communication that had been written with precision and reviewed before sending. The first paragraph noted that the federal investigation had expanded overnight to include a 4th subject in addition to Farr, Rourke, Pruitt, and Aldridge. The 4th subject was Captain David Voss of the Castleford County Narcotics Division. The second paragraph noted that Voss had been taken into custody at 2:47 in the morning after federal surveillance observed him attempting to access and remove materials from the Narcotics Task Force Records Archive. Specifically, the task force budget authorizations for the past 4 years. The third paragraph was 2 sentences. In the course of securing those materials, federal agents discovered a secondary set of records not previously identified in the investigation. These records contain evidence suggesting that the operation in Harlow Heights was not the only such system operating within the county, and that at least 2 additional jurisdictions may be involved. She read the third paragraph twice. 2 additional jurisdictions, not one operation in one borough with 1 officer and 1 supervisor and 1 county official providing cover. A model. Something that had been built in Harlow Heights, demonstrated to work, and then replicated. She looked up from her phone at the quiet street outside her windshield. The morning was beginning to lighten at the edges. That first pale shift of darkness into something less dark, the moment before the city remembered itself. She looked at it without moving. Somewhere in Castleford County, in 2 jurisdictions she didn't yet know the names of, the same notebooks were sitting in the same evidence rooms. She sat in the car until the light changed from gray to pale gold, reading the email a 3rd time as if additional readings would alter what it said. They didn't. 2 additional jurisdictions. A model, not an anomaly. Someone had looked at what Harlow Heights produced and decided it was worth replicating, and they'd built the replication quietly enough that 4 years of operation had passed without anyone connecting the threads. Until a Tuesday morning traffic stop, until a credential in a trauma kit, until 43 minutes on a bolted bench. She got out of the car. She slept for 5 hours, which was less than she needed and more than she expected to manage. When she woke at 11:30, she lay still for a moment and listened to the building, her neighbor's television through the shared wall, a delivery truck on the street below, the ordinary sounds of a Wednesday in January. Then she got up and made coffee and called Ren. He answered on the second ring. "You read the email," he said. "2 additional jurisdictions," she said. "How long have you known?" "Since 3 this morning. Ochoa called me when Voss was secured." A pause. "We didn't want to wake you." "I wasn't asleep at 3. "I know. Harmon said your shift ended at 5:30. He paused again. "The 2 jurisdictions are Kelmore Township and Dairy Falls Borough, both in Castleford County, both with sheriff's substation coverage that routes through FAR's operational structure." She sat at her kitchen table with the coffee. Kelmore and Dairy Falls were names she knew the way she knew any names in the county, abstractly, geographically, without texture. She'd driven through Kelmore once or twice. She knew Dairy Falls had a community hospital. "Same operational model?" she asked. "Close. Not identical. The Kelmore situation appears to use a different evidence logging system. We're still decoding the documentation Voss was trying to pull. Dairy Falls is more straightforward. The notation system is nearly identical to Harlow Heights, which suggests either Rourke trained someone or the documentation templates came from above. From Voss or FAR. "From someone above the officer level," Ren said. "The model is too consistent to have been independently developed." She drank her coffee. It was too hot, and she drank it anyway. "How many cases?" "Preliminary count across all 3 jurisdictions. We're looking at somewhere between 30 and 40 stops that generated evidence submissions, and between 15 and 20 that resulted in criminal charges or civil forfeiture actions." He let that sit for a moment. "That number will change. It may go higher." 30 to 40. The number hit differently than the 6 had, though 6 had already been enough to knock the air from the room. 30 to 40 people. 30 to 40 encounters with a system that had been built to look like law enforcement and function like predation. 30 to 40 notebooks. "What happens to those cases?" she asked. "Review. All of them. The federal court has a mechanism for emergency review of potentially tainted prosecutions. It's slow and it's not guaranteed to produce the result that's warranted in every instance, but it's the process that exists." Ren's voice was measured. He was a man who'd spent a long career in the space between what was warranted and what was possible, and he'd developed the vocabulary for it. "Marcus Delray's case is the most advanced. Del has filed a motion for dismissal with prejudice. The judge scheduled a hearing for Friday. Will it succeed?" "Del is good and the evidence is clear. I think it will." A pause. "I want to be honest with you. Some of the other cases may not have the same outcome. The review process has its own variables. A judge's discretion, the specific evidence in each case, the DA's office, and how aggressively they contest. It's not going to be clean for everyone." She knew that. She'd known it since Harmon had told her that the forfeited property had been liquidated. Some things couldn't be returned. Some damage didn't have a corresponding remedy in the legal system's vocabulary. And recognizing that wasn't cynicism, it was accuracy. The same accuracy she brought to a trauma assessment when she identified the injury that could be repaired and the one that couldn't. "The federal charges against FAR," she said. "Timeline?" "The U.S. Attorney's Office is filing today. The charges include organized criminal enterprise, civil rights conspiracy, abuse of public trust, and financial crimes. Rourke faces the additional charge of unlawful detention of a federal officer." He paused. "Pruitt and Aldridge have cooperation agreements in progress. They'll face reduced charges in exchange for their testimony, which I understand is frustrating." "It's how it works," she said. "I know how it works." "Voss is contesting everything," Ren said. "He's hired a criminal defense attorney who specializes in exactly this kind of federal case, and the process will be long and expensive and probably still result in a conviction, but it's going to take time." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. Time. Process. The machinery of accountability, which was real and imperfect and necessary and slower than the harm that required it. "There's something else," Ren said, and she heard the shift in his tone, the move from operational briefing to something more personal. She waited. "The hospital's administrative director contacted our office this morning," he said. "Warren Ghosh. He wanted to know whether there were any federal restrictions on the hospital issuing a public statement about your military service and your role in this investigation. I haven't authorized them to say anything. I know, I told him that, but he asked specifically whether there were federal restrictions, not whether you'd given permission. He's being careful about what angle he approaches it from. Another pause. He also contacted the county medical licensing board. Apparently there was an inquiry from an anonymous source last week suggesting that you'd been practicing outside your licensed scope during a non-hospital emergency. The inquiry was filed before your stop, before any of this was public. She was very still. An inquiry, she said. Filed 8 days ago. The board opened a preliminary file. Wren's voice was carefully neutral. Given the timing, and given what we now know about the credential query, 9 weeks ago, the FBI is treating the anonymous inquiry as potentially connected to the targeting. Someone had filed a complaint against her nursing license, not after the story broke, before it, before the stop, as a contingency or as a parallel pressure or as a way to complicate whatever situation arose from the stop. If she'd activated the transmitter and the federal response had come, and she'd been standing there with a pending licensing inquiry, it would have made her look reactive and self-interested, her credibility muddied at exactly the moment she needed it clean. Has the board taken any action? She asked. The file is open, but no action has been taken, and given what's now in the public record, I'd be surprised if it goes further. Wren paused. I'm telling you because you should know, and because the FBI wants your consent to include the licensing complaint in the evidence of coordinated targeting. They have it, she said. I thought so. A beat. How are you doing? The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because Wren was not a man who asked it casually. She considered it honestly. I'm tired, she said, and I have a shift tonight. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked out the window. Ordinary Wednesday light. I want to. She went in at 6. The parking lot had 3 news vans now, which was 2 more than the previous night. She walked from her car to the staff entrance at the same pace she always used, not hurrying, not looking at the cameras. She could feel tracking her. One reporter called her name. She kept walking. Inside, the hospital had the particular energy of a place that had been talking about something all day and had agreed, collectively and imperfectly, to be professional about it. People looked at her, some quickly, some with more sustained attention, and she returned the look steadily and moved to the locker room to change. Dana was waiting outside the locker room with 2 cups of coffee, which was not subtle. I'm fine, Nora said before Dana could say anything. I know you're fine. Dana held out a cup. I'm also fine. We're all fine. Here's your coffee. Nora took it. It was better than the vending machine version. Gosh wants to talk to you, Dana said. Tonight if possible, but not urgently. He said to tell you it's not about anything you did wrong, which I think means he's aware that opening with that would make you assume you'd done something wrong. He's not inaccurate. He wants to issue a statement about your service, your role here. He's been sitting on it all day waiting for you to come in. She drank her coffee. What kind of statement? The kind where the hospital says it's proud of you, I think. Dana paused. Which it is. Which everyone here is, including people who aren't saying it because they don't know if you want them to. Nora looked at her. Dana Quillen had been her charge nurse for 2.5 years, and in 2.5 years she'd been consistently competent, occasionally brusque, and entirely trustworthy. Not in a performed way, but in the way of someone who decided that showing up reliably was more meaningful than talking about it. I'll talk to Gosh between patients, she said. Dana nodded. Also, bed 7, Garrett. He's asking about you. She went to check on Garrett first. He was sitting up, which was better than the previous night's careful horizontal. His color was improved. Not good, but better. And the surgical team had confirmed he didn't need to go back to the OR. When she came in, he looked at her with the specific relief of someone who'd been waiting for a familiar face. You're back, he said. I'm back. They kept talking about you last night, the other nurses. He gestured vaguely at the room. What happened to you? The police thing. She checked his chart. His vitals had stabilized overnight. How are you feeling this morning compared to last night? Better. Still bad, but better. He paused. Did they really arrest the whole police department? Not the whole department, she said. Some people in it. He watched her adjust the monitor settings. Were you scared? She thought about the honest answer, the holding room, the bolted bench, the cuffs, the specific calculation about when to activate the transmitter, the weight of the decision that once made couldn't be unmade. "I was angry," she said. "Scared wasn't the right word for it." He looked at her for a moment. "My cousin got stopped last year," he said, "over in Kelmore. They took his car. Said it was connected to a drug thing, but he doesn't do any of that. He just had cash on him from a construction job." He paused. "He never got it back. The car or the money." She stopped what she was doing. Kelmore. One of the two additional jurisdictions. Same model, different borough, same outcome for a man who'd had cash from a construction job and the wrong vehicle, on the wrong road at the wrong time. "Your cousin," she said carefully. "Does he have a lawyer?" "He couldn't afford one. The public defender said there wasn't much to do because the forfeiture had already been processed." Garrett looked at his hands. "He saved for 3 years for that car." She looked at him. Then she pulled out her phone and wrote a number on the back of a blank medication label and put it on his bedside table. "That's the number for the federal public defender's office in Castleford," she said. "Ask for Patricia Dell. Tell her your cousin's name and what happened. Tell her it was Kelmore Township." She paused. "The situation may have changed." Garrett looked at the number. Then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She put her phone away and went to find Gosh. The federal charges against Leonard Farr were filed publicly at 2:17 in the afternoon on Thursday. Nora was asleep when it happened. She'd come home at 6 in the morning, eaten something, and slept until noon, which her body accepted without negotiation. She woke to the phone, not a call, but a cascade of notifications she'd forgotten to silence, and she lay in bed and scrolled through them with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that the news would be the same in 5 minutes as it was right now. The charges were comprehensive. The U.S. Attorney's Office had filed on all 4 subjects simultaneously: Farr, Rourke, Voss, and an additional defendant named in the Kelmore documentation whose name she didn't recognize, a lieutenant named Hartman, who had been running the Kelmore operation as a local coordinator while Farr's structure provided the financial architecture above him. Hartman had been arrested at his home at 6 in the morning, which the news was covering with the same aerial footage it used for every pre-dawn arrest: the dark street, the lights of federal vehicles, the specific theater of public accountability being performed in real time. Rourke's charges included the federal credential violation, unlawful detention, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. The list was long enough that the news anchors were reading from notes. She got up and made coffee. At 2 in the afternoon, she drove to the federal courthouse, not for a hearing, but to meet Dell, who had called the previous day and asked if Nora would be willing to provide a brief written statement to accompany the dismissal motion in Del Rey's case. Not testimony, not a deposition. A statement, voluntarily provided, describing what she'd experienced and what the evidence log had subsequently revealed. She'd written it that morning in 40 minutes at her kitchen table. It was 4 paragraphs, factual, without editorializing. She handed it to Dell in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the courthouse. Dell read it. When she finished, she set it down on the table and didn't say anything for a moment. "This is good," she said finally. "This is exactly what the motion needs." She looked at Nora. "I want you to know, Marcus Del Rey knows your name. He knows who you are and what triggered this. He asked me to tell you that." "How is he doing?" Nora asked. "He's been in county holding for 3 weeks, Del said without softening it. "He's doing what people do when they're waiting to find out if the system is going to fix what it broke." She paused. "The hearing is tomorrow. I think we're going to win it." "What happens if you do?" "He goes home," Del said simply. "He's been in holding because he couldn't make bail on the possession charge. If the charge is dismissed, he goes home." 3 weeks in county holding. A man who'd been stopped on a road, had something planted in his vehicle, and had spent 3 weeks in a cell waiting for a system to correct what it had done. Nora thought about what 3 weeks in a cell does to a person who hasn't done anything, the specific damage of it, the way it restructures a person's relationship with every institution they'll encounter afterward. "Tell him I hope he gets home before the weekend," she said. Del nodded. "He will." The dismissal hearing was Friday morning, 10:15, courtroom 7 of the Castleford County Courthouse. Nora was not in the gallery. She had a shift at noon, and she had no role in the proceedings. Her statement had been submitted and accepted and would speak without her presence. She was at the hospital when Harmon texted, "Dismissed with prejudice. Delray released this afternoon." She read it between patients, standing at the nurse's station with a chart in her other hand. She put the phone back in her pocket and went back to work. At 4 o'clock, she saw the news coverage on the break room television. Marcus Delray walking out of the county holding facility, a slight man in his 30s, in clothes that didn't quite fit because they were the clothes he'd come in with 3 weeks earlier. His mother was there. He held on to her for a long time on the sidewalk while cameras captured it from a distance. And then he looked up at the January sky with an expression that didn't have a clean name, relief and exhaustion, and something older than both. Dana turned off the television. Neither of them said anything. Then Dana said, "Come on, Bed 11 needs reassessment." They went to Bed 11. What? Warren Gosch issued the hospital's statement on Friday afternoon. Nora had agreed to it, with revisions. She'd taken out the parts that described her military service in terms she found performative, the words that turned 8 years of difficult work into something that sounded like a recruitment poster. She'd left in the parts that were factual, her years at the hospital, her work in the trauma unit, the hospital's full support for the federal investigation, and the legal process now underway. The statement made no mention of the anonymous licensing complaint. That had been resolved Thursday afternoon when the medical board closed the preliminary file without action, noting that the inquiry appeared to have been filed without substantive basis. Gosch had sent her an email about it with the subject line, "Resolved." She'd replied with a single word, "Thank you." The day the statement went out, she was approached in the hallway outside the trauma unit by a third-year resident named Kwame, who had been at the hospital for 8 months and whom she'd worked alongside several times. He was young and serious and sometimes too cautious in a crisis, which she'd addressed twice in the direct way that worked better than gentleness for someone who needed to develop faster decision-making. He stopped her in the hallway. "I wanted to say something," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it all week." She waited. "I didn't know any of it," he said. "The military part. I've worked with you for 8 months, and I didn't know." He paused. "But that's not the thing. The thing is, you could have told them. When they stopped you, you could have explained everything and probably they would have—" "Probably not," she said. Rourke wasn't interested in explanation. "But you could have tried. You could have made more noise about it." "I showed my credentials," she said. "That was the correct procedure. If correct procedure isn't enough, making more noise about it isn't the solution. It's evidence of how badly the procedure has failed." He looked at her. He was working through it, she could see. The thing he'd been trying to articulate all week, the lesson he wanted to draw from what had happened. "I keep thinking," he said, "that you were just quiet through all of it, and then everything came apart." "The quiet wasn't passivity," she said. "I was paying attention. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. Then, "Were you scared? At any point?" She thought about Garrett asking the same question, about the honest answer she'd given. "There was a moment," she said, "when I saw the evidence bag closed, when I understood that someone had decided what the situation was going to be regardless of what was actually true." She paused. "That was the moment I stopped waiting and activated the transmitter. Not because I was scared, because waiting had told me what I needed to know." Kwame looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." He went back to his work. She went back to hers. The sentencing of Dale Rourke took place 11 weeks later, on a Thursday in late March, when the January cold had finally released its grip on Castleford and the courthouse steps were wet with the particular slush of early spring. Nora went. She hadn't planned to. She told Harmon she'd skip it, that she had no interest in watching proceedings that would resolve themselves appropriately without her presence. But on the morning of the sentencing, she'd woken at 5:30, lain in bed for 20 minutes, and then gotten up and put on clothes that weren't scrubs and driven to the courthouse. She sat in the back row of the gallery. The federal proceedings had moved through their stages with the methodical momentum of a large institution processing a significant case. Pruitt had pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony that had been central to establishing the full scope of Farr's operation. Aldridge had done the same. Voss, after months of contested proceedings, had been convicted on all counts in a trial that had lasted 9 days and produced testimony from 31 witnesses, including 2 people who'd had property seized under the Kelmore operation and had traveled to testify despite everything it cost them to get there. Hartman had pleaded guilty in the Kelmore case the week before. Farr's trial was scheduled for May. His attorneys were working every procedural angle available, which was their job, and the case against him was so thoroughly documented that Ochoa had told Nora in February that she'd stopped being nervous about the outcome and started being impatient about the timeline. Rourke had pleaded guilty to a negotiated set of federal charges that was still, by any measure, comprehensive. Unlawful detention of a federal officer, evidence tampering, civil rights violations under color of law, and conspiracy. His cooperation had been limited and reluctant, offered only when his attorneys had made clear there was no viable alternative. The judge was a man named Farwell, who had presided over federal criminal matters for 19 years and had the face of someone who'd heard most of what humans were capable of and had arrived at a relationship with it that was neither shocked nor indifferent, but simply, precisely attentive. He sentenced Rourke to 11 years in federal prison. He did not editorialize extensively. He read from his written statement in the measured language of a court that understood its words would be read and quoted and examined. And in that language, he described what Rourke had done. The stops, the fabrication, the evidence room, the cases, the people whose lives had been damaged by the specific decision to treat the authority of a badge as a personal tool rather than a public trust. Then he said one sentence that was not in the measured language of the rest. "The woman you laughed at," he said, "was doing her job correctly. You were not." The gallery was quiet. Rourke stood in his suit, the civilian suit of a man who no longer wore a uniform, who no longer had a uniform to wear, and received the sentence with the stillness of someone who had finally run out of calculations. Nora sat in the back row and watched. She did not feel the satisfaction she'd expected to feel, or the satisfaction she'd observed other people feeling about moments like this. What she felt was quieter and more complicated, a recognition that the sentence was right and necessary, and also profoundly inadequate to the sum of what had been done, that 11 years was both a significant consequence and an arithmetic that would never balance against the people who'd spent their own time in county, holding or lost their vehicles or carried the weight of a criminal record through job applications and landlord questions and every other structure that read a person's history and made its own quiet decisions. The law was not justice. The law was the available approximation of justice, and knowing the difference was not defeatism. It was the thing that kept you from mistaking the approximation for the end of the work. She left before the gallery emptied. She didn't speak to anyone. But in May, she testified at Farr's trial. Her testimony was 2 hours, direct examination, and cross-examination combined. The defense attorney was skilled and pushed her on the points he could push: the nature of the federal classification, the decision to use the transmitter rather than continuing to wait, the specific sequence of events in the holding room. And she answered everything accurately and without the emotional performance that would have made the testimony feel like advocacy rather than account. Farr sat at the defense table throughout, in a suit that fit well and a posture that held its shape. He was 63 years old and had been a county official for 14 years and had built something patient and systematic and profitable out of the legal authority that had been placed in his care, and he looked at her during her testimony with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man reassessing a situation he thought he controlled. She looked back. She didn't look away. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Farr's sentencing was set for late July. The federal guidelines on his charges put his range at 15 to 22 years. Ochoa called her that evening. "He's going to appeal," she said. "It's going to take a long time, but he's not going anywhere." "I know," Nora said. "You did good today," Ochoa said. "I told the truth," Nora said. "That's not the same thing as doing good. It's just what accurate looks like." A pause. Then Ochoa said something Nora hadn't expected. "Do you ever let anyone give you credit for things?" Nora thought about it honestly. "I let Dana give me coffee," she said. Ochoa made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That'll have to do." 3 months after the trial, on a Tuesday evening in August, Nora was in the trauma bay when they brought in a woman who'd been in a car accident on the interstate. Severe laceration to the left forearm, possible internal, pressure dropping. She worked the case fast and without ceremony, the way she always worked, reading the information, making decisions, communicating the decisions in the flat, direct language that the situation required. The woman stabilized. Afterward, in the hallway, the attending, a surgeon named Reyes, who'd been at Castleford Memorial for 6 years and was excellent at her job and not especially given to sentiment, stopped Nora and said, "Good work in there." "The vascular team was fast," Nora said. "I'm talking about what you did," Reyes said. "The first 8 minutes, before the team got there. You bought her those 8 minutes." Nora looked at her. "Thank you," she said. It was the hardest thing to say, and she meant it. In September, she received a letter from Marcus Del Rey. It was handwritten, 3 pages, the kind of letter that had been revised. She could see places where the pen had gone over words more than once. He wrote about the 3 weeks in holding in terms that were plain and specific and not softened. The smell, the noise, the particular psychological labor of maintaining the belief that the situation would eventually correct itself when every structure around you was telling you it wouldn't. He wrote about his mother on the sidewalk. He wrote about going back to his job. He worked in logistics, warehouse management, and the look on his manager's face when he returned, which had been complicated. He wrote about Garrett's cousin. He'd heard from Patricia Dell that a referral had come through that had helped recover the forfeited vehicle, not the original car which had been liquidated, but a settlement from the county in an amount that had made it possible to replace it. He didn't know where the referral had come from, but Dell had mentioned something about a nurse. He wrote, "I don't know what you were thinking when you went through what you went through. I don't know if you knew it would matter to anybody except yourself. I just wanted you to know it mattered to me. I wanted you to know someone thought about you when they drove their car home." She read the letter twice. Then she put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept things she didn't know what to do with but wasn't willing to throw away. She thought about what he'd written. "I don't know if you knew it would matter to anybody except yourself." She'd activated the transmitter because the situation was wrong and the protocol existed and she'd been trained to use the tools that were available. That was all. She hadn't thought about Marcus Del Rey because she hadn't known he existed. She hadn't thought about Garrett's cousin or the 3 forfeiture cases or the 30 to 40 stops across 3 jurisdictions. She'd thought about 43 minutes on a bolted bench and a credential case in an evidence bag, and whether the person who'd put it there was going to be held to the standard that the credential represented. That was the thing about the work. Any work. Whether you were pulling someone back from a hemorrhage or sitting in a holding room deciding when to press a button. You couldn't see the full shape of what you were doing while you were doing it. You saw the immediate problem. You used the tools you had. The full shape emerged later, from a direction you hadn't been looking. She didn't think that was heroic. She thought it was just how consequence worked. On the last Tuesday of October, she drove home from a night shift through Harlow Heights. Not deliberately. The freight train crossing on Aldrich was backed up, and she took the alternate route on instinct, the way you take a route you've taken 100 times. And she was 3 blocks into the borough before she registered where she was. The street was the same. The houses were the same. The streetlights were the same. She passed the curb where she'd pulled over in January, the same curbside with the same mailbox and the same strip of concrete, and she drove past it without slowing. The Harlow Heights Police Department had been under federal oversight since January. Its operations had been restructured under a consent decree. Several officers had resigned. New supervisory protocols had been implemented by the county, which itself was operating under a significantly different leadership structure, given that its deputy commissioner had pleaded not guilty and was awaiting trial. The borough looked like a borough. It looked like what it had always been. Houses and streets and streetlights, and the ordinary geography of people living their ordinary lives inside structures that either protected them or didn't, depending on who was running the structures and what they'd decided the structures were for. She drove out of the borough and onto the main road back to her apartment. In the early morning quiet, Castleford was doing what it always did at this hour, breathing, existing, holding its complexity without announcing it. The diner on the ground floor of the building across from her apartment was open, and she could see the man at the counter, same stool, same newspaper, the specific constancy of someone who'd made peace with their morning routines. She parked and sat for a moment. She thought about what Wren had said, the night of the arrest, when she'd told him the thread was the notebook, the acknowledgement of a person who'd said the right thing. She thought about what Kwame had said in the hallway. You were just quiet, and then everything came apart. She thought about Dell saying he goes home, simply, as if home was a simple thing, which it wasn't, but which was the only word for what Del Rey had been trying to get back to for 3 weeks. The thing about quiet strength, the real version of it, not the version that got turned into a lesson or a headline, was that it didn't feel strong while it was happening. It felt like paying attention when everything in the room was telling you that your attention didn't matter. It felt like holding a standard in your hands when someone was laughing at the standard and telling you it wasn't real. It felt like sitting on a bolted bench for 43 minutes and deciding that the right response to being dismissed was not to become someone who could not be dismissed, but to remain exactly who you were until the situation had no choice but to account for it. She was not a symbol. She was a trauma nurse with bruised wrists and a federal credential and a car that needed new rear tires and a kitchen drawer with a letter in it and a patient named Garrett who'd asked if she was scared and a patient named Delray she'd never meet who drove his car home. She was imperfect and tired and not done. She got out of the car and walked into her building, and behind her the October morning opened up slowly over Castleford, the light arriving without announcement, the way it always arrived, indifferent to what the day would require of the people it fell on, offering nothing except visibility, which was, she'd learned a long time